Chapter 17, Part 1 of the Life of Harriet Beecher Stowe, compiled from her letters and journals by her son Charles Edward Stowe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17, Florida, 1865 through 1869. Part 1. Letter to Duchess of Argyll. Mrs. Stowe desires to have a home at the South. Florida, the best field for doing good. She buys a place at Mandarin. A charming winter residence. Palmetto leaves. Easter Sunday at Mandarin. Correspondence with Dr. Holmes. Pogonoc people. Receptions in New Orleans and Tallahassee. Last winter at Mandarin. In 1866, the terrible conflict between the North and South having ended, Mrs. Stowe wrote the following letter to the Duchess of Argyll. Hartford, February 19th, 1866. My dear friend, your letter was a real spring of comfort to me, bringing refreshingly the pleasant library at Inverary and the lovely days I spent there. I am grieved at what you say of your dear mother's health. I showed your letter to Mrs. Perkins, and we both agreed in saying that we should like for a time to fill the place of maid to her, as doubtless you all feel too. I should so love to be with her, to read to her, to talk to her, and oh, there is so much that would cheer and comfort a noble heart like hers that we could talk about. Oh, my friend, when I think of what has been done these last few years, and of what is now doing, I am lost in amazement. I have, just by way of realizing it to myself, been reading Uncle Tom's Cabin again, and when I read that book, scarred and seared and burned into with the memories of an anguish and horror that can never be forgotten, and think it is all over now, all past, and that now the questions debated are simply of more or less time before granting legal suffrage to those who so lately were held only as articles of merchandise, when this comes over me, I think no private or individual sorrow can ever make me wholly without comfort. If my faith in God's presence and real living power in the affairs of men ever grows dim, this makes it impossible to doubt. I have just had a sweet and lovely Christian letter from Garrison, whose beautiful composure and thankfulness in his hour of victory are as remarkable as his wonderful courage in the day of moral battle. His note ends with the words, "And who but God is to be glorified?" Garrison's attitude is far more exalted than that of Wendell Phillips. He acknowledges the great deed done. He suspends his liberator with words of devout thanksgiving, and devotes himself unobtrusively to the work yet to be accomplished for the freedmen, while Phillips seems resolved to ignore the mighty work that has been done because of the inevitable shortcomings and imperfections that beset it still. We have a Congress of splendid men, men of stalwart principle and determination. We have a President, Andrew Johnson, honestly seeking to do right, and if he fails in knowing just what right is, it is because he is a man born and reared in a slave state, and acted on by many influences which we cannot rightly estimate unless we were in his place. My brother Henry has talked with him earnestly and confidentially, and has faith in him as an earnest, good man seeking to do right. Henry takes the ground that it is unwise and impolitic to endeavor to force Negro suffrage on the South at the point of the bayonet. His policy would be to hold over the Negro the protection of our Freedmen's Bureau until the great laws of free labor shall begin to draw the master and servant together, to endeavor to soothe and conciliate, and win to act with us a party composed of the really good men at the South. For this reason he has always advocated lenity of measures toward them. He wants to get them into a state in which the moral influence of the North can act upon them beneficially, and to get such a state of things that there will be a party at the South to protect the Negro. Charles Sumner is looking simply at the abstract right of the thing. Henry looks at actual possibilities. We all know that the state of society at the South is such that laws are a very inadequate protection even to white men. Southern elections always have been scenes of mob violence when only white men voted. Multitudes of lives have been lost at the polls in this way, and if against their will Negro suffrage was forced upon them, I do not see how anyone in their senses can expect anything less than an immediate war of races. If Negro suffrage were required as a condition of acquiring political position, there is no doubt the slave states would grant it nominally, because they would know that the grant never could or would become an actual realization, and what would then be gained for the Negro? I am sorry that people cannot differ on such great and perplexing public questions without impugning each other's motives. Henry has been called a backslider because of the lenity of his counsels, but I cannot but think it is the Spirit of Christ that influences him. Garrison has been in the same way spoken of as a deserter, because he says that a work that is done shall be called done, and because he would not keep up an anti-slavery society when slavery is abolished, and I think our President is much injured by the abuse that is heaped on him, and the selfish and unworthy motives that are ascribed to him by those who seem determined to allow to nobody an honest, unselfish difference in judgment from their own. Harry has often spoken of you and your Duke as pleasant memories in a scene of almost superhuman labor and excitement. He often said to me, "When this is all over, when we have won the victory, then I will write to the Duchess." But when it was over and the flag raised again at Sumter, his arm was smitten down with the news of our President's death. We all appreciate your noble and true sympathy through the dark hour of our national trial. You and yours are almost the only friends we now have left in England. You cannot know what it was unless you could imagine your own country to be in danger of death, extinction of nationality. That, dear friend, is an experience which shows us what we are and what we can feel. I am glad to hear that we may hope to see your son in this country. I fear so many pleasant calls will beset his path that we cannot hope for a moment, but it would give us all the greatest pleasure to see him here. Our dull, prosy, commonplace, though good old Hartford could offer few attractions compared with Boston or New York, and yet I hope he will not leave us out altogether if he comes among us. God bless him. You are very happy indeed in being permitted to keep all your dear ones and see them growing up. I want to ask a favor. Do you have, as we do, carte de visite? If you have, and could send me one of yourself and the Duke and of Lady Edith and your eldest son, I should be so very glad to see how you are looking now. And the dear mother, too, I should so like to see how she looks. It seems almost like a dream to look back to those pleasant days. I am glad to see you still keep some memories of our goings-on. Georgie's marriage is a very happy one to us. They live in Stockbridge, the loveliest part of Massachusetts, and her husband is a most devoted pastor, and gives all his time and property to the great work which he has embraced, purely for the love of it. My other daughters are with me, and my son, Captain Stowe, who has come with weakened health through our struggle, suffering constantly from the effects of a wound in his head received at Gettysburg, which makes his returning to his studies a hard struggle. My husband is in better health since he resigned his professorship, and desires his most sincere regards to yourself and the Duke, and his profound veneration to your mother. Sister Mary also desires to be remembered to you, as do also my daughters. Please tell me a little in your next of Lady Edith. She must be very lovely now. I am, with sincerest affection, ever yours, H.B. Stowe. Soon after the close of the war, Mrs. Stowe conceived the idea of making for herself and her family a winter home in the South, where she might escape the rigors of northern winters, and where her afflicted son Frederick might enjoy an out-of-door life throughout the year. She was also most anxious to do her share towards educating and leading to a higher life those colored people whom she had helped so largely to set free, and who were still in a state of profound ignorance imposed by slavery. In writing of her hopes and plans to her brother Charles Beecher in 1886, she says, quote, My plan of going to Florida, as it lies in my mind, is not in any sense a mere worldly enterprise. I have for many years had a longing to be more immediately doing Christ's work on earth. My heart is with those poor people whose cause in words I have tried to plead, and who now, ignorant and docile, are just in that formative stage in which whoever seizes has them. Corrupt politicians are already beginning to speculate on them as possible capital for their schemes, and to fill their poor heads with all sorts of vagaries. Florida is the state into which they have, more than anywhere else, been pouring. Emigration is positively and decidedly setting that way, but as yet it is mere worldly emigration, with the hope of making money, nothing more. The Episcopal Church is, however, undertaking, under direction of the future Bishop of Florida, a wide-embracing scheme of Christian activity for the whole state. In this work I desire to be associated, and my plan is to locate at some salient point on the St. Johns River where I can form the nucleus of a Christian neighborhood whose influence shall be felt far beyond its own limits." End quote. During this year, Mrs. Stowe partially carried her plan into execution by hiring an old plantation called Laurel Grove on the west side of the St. Johns River near the present village of Orange Park. Here she established her son Frederick as a cotton planter, and here he remained for 2 years. This location did not, however, prove entirely satisfactory, nor did the raising of cotton prove to be, under the circumstances, a profitable business. After visiting Florida during the winter of 1866-67, at which time her attention was drawn to the beauties and superior advantages of Mandarin on the east side of the river, Mrs. Stowe writes from Hartford, May 29, 1867, to Reverend Charles Beecher: "My dear brother, we are now thinking seriously of a place in Mandarin much more beautiful than any other in the vicinity. It has on it 5 large date palms, an olive tree in full bearing, besides a fine orange grove which this year will yield about 75,000 oranges. If we get that, then I want you to consider the expediency of buying the one next to it. It contains about 200 acres of land, on which is a fine orange grove, the fruit from which last year brought in $2,000 as sold at the wharf. It is right on the river, and 4 steamboats pass it each week on their way to Savannah and Charleston. There is on the place a very comfortable cottage, as houses go out there, where you do not need to be built as substantially as with us. I am now in correspondence with the Bishop of Florida with a view to establishing a line of churches along the St. Johns River, and if I settle at Mandarin, it will be one of my stations. Will you consent to enter the Episcopal Church and to be our clergyman? You are just the man we want. If my tasks and feelings did not incline me toward the Church, I should still choose it as the best system for training immature minds such as those of our Negroes. The system was composed with reference to the wants of the laboring class of England, at a time when they were as ignorant as our Negroes now are. I long to be at this work, and cannot think of it without my heart burning within me. Still, I'll leave all with my God, to do all that I want to for his poor people. Affectionately yours, H.B. Stowe." Mrs. Stowe had for some years before this joined the Episcopal Church for the sake of attending the same communion as her daughters who were Episcopalians. Her brother Charles did not, however, see fit to change his creed, and though he went to Florida, he settled 160 miles west from the St. Johns River at Newport, near St. Mark's on the Gulf Coast, and about 20 miles from Tallahassee. Here he lived every winter and several summers for 15 years, and here he left the impress of his own remarkably sweet and lovely character upon the scattered population of the entire region. Mrs. Stowe, in the meantime, purchased the property with its orange grove and comfortable cottage that she had recommended to him, and thus Mandarin became her winter home. No one who has ever seen it can forget the peaceful beauty of this Florida home and its surroundings. The house, a 1.5-story cottage of many gables, stands on a bluff overlooking the broad St. Johns, which is 5 miles wide at this point. It nestles in the shade of a grove of superb moss-hung live oaks, around one of which the front piazza is built. Several fine old orange trees also stand near the cottage, scenting the air with the sweet perfume of their blossoms in early spring, and offering their golden fruit to whoever may choose to pluck it during the winter months. Back of the house stretches the well-tended orange grove in which Mrs. Stowe took such genuine pride and pleasure. Everywhere about the dwelling and within it were flowers and singing birds, while the rose garden in front, at the foot of the bluff, was the admiration of all who saw it. Here, on the front piazza, beneath the grand oaks, looking out on the calm, sunlit river, Professor Stowe enjoyed that absolute peace and restful quiet for which his scholarly nature had always longed, but which had been forbidden to the greater part of his active life. At almost any hour of the day, the well-known figure, with snow-white patriarchal beard and kindly face, might be seen sitting there, with a basket of books, many of them in dead and nearly forgotten languages, close at hand. An amusing incident of family life was as follows. Some northern visitors seemed to think that the family had no rights which were worthy of a moment's consideration. They would land at the wharf, roam about the place, pick flowers, peer into the house through the windows and doors, and act with that disregard of all the proprieties of life which characterizes ill-bred people when on a journey. The professor had been driven well-nigh distracted by these migratory bipeds. One day, when one of them broke a branch from an orange tree directly before his eyes and was bearing it off in triumph with all its load of golden fruit, he leaped from his chair and addressed the astonished individual on those fundamental principles of common honesty which he deemed outraged by this act. The address was vigorous and truthful, but of a kind which will not bear repeating. "Why," said the horror-stricken culprit, "I thought that this was Mrs. Stowe's place." "You thought it was Mrs. Stowe's place?" Then, in a voice of thunder, "I would have you understand, sir, that I am the proprietor and protector of Mrs. Stowe and of this place, and if you commit any more such shameful depredations, I will have you punished as you deserve." Thus this predatory Yankee was taught to realize that there is a God in Israel. In April 1869, Mrs. Stowe was obliged to hurry north in order to visit Canada in time to protect her English rights in Oldtown Folks, which she had just finished. About this time she secured a plot of land and made arrangements for the erection on it of a building that should be used as a schoolhouse through the week and as a church on Sunday. For several years Professor Stowe preached during the winter in this little schoolhouse, and Mrs. Stowe conducted Sunday school, sewing classes, singing classes, and various other gatherings for instruction and amusement, all of which were well attended and highly appreciated by both the white and colored residents of the neighborhood. Upon one occasion, having just arrived at her Mandarin home, Mrs. Stowe writes, quote, "At last, after waiting a day and a half in Charleston, we arrived here at 10 o'clock Saturday morning, just a week from the day we sailed. The house looked so pretty and quiet and restful, the day was so calm and lovely, it seemed as though I had passed away from all trouble, and was looking back upon you all from a secure resting place. Mr. Stowe is very happy here, and is constantly saying how pleasant it is, and how glad he is that he is here. He is so much improved in health that already he is able to take a considerable walk every day. We are all well, contented, and happy, and we have 6 birds, 2 dogs, and a pony. Do write more and oftener. Tell me all the little nothings and nowheres. You can't imagine how they are magnified by the time they have reached into this remote corner." End quote. In 1872, she wrote a series of Florida sketches, which were published in book form the following year by J.R. Osgood and Company under the title of Palmetto Leaves. May 19, 1873, she writes to her brother Charles at Newport, Florida. Quote, "Although you have not answered my last letter, I cannot leave Florida without saying goodbye. I send you the palmetto leaves and my parting love. If I could have either brought or left my husband, I should have come to see you this winter. The account of your roses fills me with envy. We leave on the San Jacinta next Saturday, and I am making the most of the few charming hours yet left, for never did we have so delicious a spring. I never knew such altogether perfect weather. It is enough to make a saint out of the toughest old Calvinist that ever set his face as a flint. How do you think New England theology would have fared if our fathers had been landed here instead of on Plymouth Rock? The next you hear of me will be at the North, where our address is Forest Street, Hartford. We have bought a pretty cottage there, near to Bell, and shall spend the summer there." End of Chapter 17, Part 1. Read for you by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Chapter 17, Part 2 of the Life of Harriet Beecher Stowe, compiled from her letters and journals by her son Charles Edward Stowe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17, Florida, 1865 through 1869, Part 2. In a letter written in May of the following year to her son Charles at Harvard, Mrs. Stowe says, quote, "I can hardly realize that this long, flowery summer, with its procession of blooms and fruit, has been running on at the same time with the snowbanks and sleet storms of the North. But so it is. It is now the 1st of May. Strawberries and blackberries are over with us. Oranges are in a waning condition, few and far between. Now we are going north to begin another summer, and have roses, strawberries, blackberries, and green peas come again. I am glad to hear of your reading. The effect produced on you by Jonathan Edwards is very similar to that produced on me when I took the same mental bath. His was a mind whose grasp and intensity you cannot help feeling. He was a poet in the intensity of his conceptions, and some of his sermons are more terrible than Dante's Inferno." End quote. In November 1874, upon their return to Mandarin, she writes, quote, "We have had heavenly weather, and we needed it, for our house was a cave of spiderwebs, cockroaches, dirt, and all abominations. But less than a week has brought it into beautiful order. It now begins to put on that quaint, lively, pretty air that so fascinates me. Our weather is, as I said, heavenly, neither hot nor cold, cool, calm, bright, serene, and so tranquilizing. There is something indescribable about the best weather we have down here. It does not debilitate me like the soft October air in Hartford." End quote. During the following February, she writes in reply to an invitation to visit a northern watering place late in the season, quote, "I shall be most happy to come, and know of nothing to prevent. I have, thank goodness, no serial story on hand for this summer to hang like an old man of the sea about my neck, and I hope to enjoy a little season of being like other folks. It is a most lovely day today, most unfallen, Eden-like." End quote. In a letter written later in the same season, March 28, 1875, Mrs. Stowe gives us a pleasant glimpse at their preparations for a proper observance of Easter Sunday in the little Mandarin schoolhouse. She says, "It was the week before Easter, and we had on our minds the dressing of the church. There my 2 Gothic fireboards were to be turned into a pulpit for the occasion. I went to Jacksonville and got a 5-inch molding for a base, and then had 1 fireboard sawed in 2, so that there was an arched panel for each end. Then came a rummage for something for a top, and to make a desk of, until it suddenly occurred to me that our old black walnut extension table had a set of leaves. They were exactly the thing. The whole was trimmed with a beading of yellow pine, and rubbed, and pumice-stoned, and oiled, and I got out my tubes of paint, and painted the nail holes with Van Dyke brown. By Saturday morning it was a lovely little Gothic pulpit, and Anthony carried it over to the schoolhouse, and took away the old desk, which I gave him for his meeting-house. That afternoon we drove out into the woods, and gathered a quantity of superb Easter lilies, pawpaw, sparkleberry, great fern leaves, and cedar. In the evening the girls went over to the meads to practice Easter hymns, but I sat at home and made a cross, 18 inches long, of cedar and white lilies. This southern cedar is the most exquisite thing. It is so feathery and delicate. Sunday morning was cool and bright, a most perfect Easter. Our little church was full, and everybody seemed delighted with the decorations. Mr. Stowe preached a sermon to show that Christ is going to put everything right at last, which is comforting. So the day was one of real pleasure, and also, I trust, of real benefit to the poor souls who learned from it that Christ is indeed risen for them." End quote. During this winter, the following characteristic letters passed between Mrs. Stowe and her valued friend, Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes, called forth by the sending to the latter of a volume of Mrs. Stowe's latest stories. Boston, January 8, 1876. My dear Mrs. Stowe, I would not write to thank you for your most welcome Christmas box, a box whose sweets compacted lie, before I had read it and every word of it. I have been very much taken up with the antics of one kind and another, and have only finished it this afternoon. The last of the papers was of less comparative value to me than to a great fraction of your immense parish of readers, because I am so familiar with every movement of the Pilgrims in their own chronicles. Deacon Pitkin's farm is full of those thoroughly truthful touches of New England, in which, if you are not unrivaled, I do not know who your rival may be. I wiped the tears from one eye in reading Deacon Pitkin's farm. I wiped the tears, and plenty of them, from both eyes in reading Betty's Bright Idea. It is a most charming and touching story, and nobody can read who has not a heart like a pebble without being melted into tenderness. How much you have done and are doing to make our New England life wholesome and happy! If there is anyone who can look back over a literary life which has pictured our old and helped our new civilization, it is yourself. Of course, your later books have harder work cut out for them than those of any other writer. They have had Uncle Tom's Cabin for a rival. The brightest torch casts a shadow in the blaze of a light, and any transcendent success affords the easiest handle for that class of critics whose method is the one that Dogberry held to be odious. I think it grows pleasanter to us to be remembered by the friends we have, as with each year they grow fewer. We have lost Agassiz and Sumner from our circle, and I found Motley stricken with threatening illness, which I hope is gradually yielding to treatment, in the profoundest grief at the loss of his wife, another old and dear friend of mine. So you may be assured that I feel most sensibly your kind attention, and send you my heartfelt thanks for remembering me. Always, dear Mrs. Stowe, faithfully yours, O. W. Holmes. To this letter Mrs. Stowe replied as follows. Mandarin, February 23rd, 1876. Dear Doctor, how kind it was of you to write me that very beautiful note. And how I wish you were just where I am, to see the trees laden at the same time with golden oranges and white blossoms. I should so like to cut off a golden cluster, leaves and all, for you. Well, Boston seems very far away and dreamy, like some previous state of existence, as I sit on the veranda and gaze on the receding shores of the St. John's, which at this point is 5 miles wide. Dear Doctor, how time slips by! I remember when Sumner seemed to me a young man, and now he has gone. And Wilson has gone. And Chase, whom I knew as a young man in society in Cincinnati, has gone, and Stanton has gone, and Seward has gone, and yet how lively the world races on. A few air bubbles of praise or lamentation, and away sails the great ship of life, no matter over whose grave. Well, one cannot but feel it. To me, also, a whole generation of friends has gone from the other side of the water since I was there and broke kindly bread with them. The Duchess of Sutherland, the good old Duke, Lansdowne, Ellesmere, Lady Byron, Lord and Lady Amberley, Charles Kingsley, the good Quaker, Joseph Sturge, all are with the shadowy train that has moved on. Among them were as dear and true friends as I ever had, and as pure and noble specimens of human beings as God ever made. They are living somewhere in intense vitality, I must believe, and you, dear Doctor, must not doubt. I think about your writings a great deal, and one element in them always attracts me. It is their pitiful and sympathetic vein, the pity for poor, struggling human nature. In this I feel that you must be very near and dear to him whose name is love. You wrote some verses once that have got into the hymn books, and have often occurred to me in my most sacred hours as descriptive of the feelings with which I bear the sorrows and carry the cares of life. They begin, "Love divine that stooped to share." I have not all your books down here, and am haunted by gaps in the verses that memory cannot make good. But it is that love divine which is my stay and comfort and hope, as one friend after another passes beyond sight and hearing. Please let me have it in your handwriting. I remember a remark you once made on spiritualism. I cannot recall the words, but you spoke of it as modifying the sharp angles of Calvinistic belief as a fog does those of a landscape. I would like to talk with you some time on spiritualism and show you a collection of very curious facts that I have acquired through mediums not professional. Mr. Stowe has just been wading through 8 volumes of La Mystique by Gorez, professor for 40 years past in the University of Munich, first of physiology and latterly of philosophy. He examines the whole cycle of abnormal psychic, spiritual facts, trances, ecstasy, clairvoyance, witchcraft, spiritualism, etc., etc., as shown in the Romish miracles and the history of Europe. I have long since come to the conclusion that the marvels of spiritualism are natural and not supernatural phenomenon, an uncommon working of natural laws. I believe that the door between those in the body and those out has never in any age been entirely closed, and that occasional perceptions within the veil are a part of the course of nature, and therefore not miraculous. Of course, such a phase of human experience is very substantial ground for every kind of imposture and superstition, and I have no faith whatever in mediums who practice for money. In their case, I think the law of Moses that forbade consulting those who dealt with familiar spirits is a very wise one. Do write some more, dear doctor. You are too well off in your place down there on the new land. Your centennial ballad was a charming little peep. Now give us a full-fledged story. Mr. Stowe sends his best regards and wishes you would read Gorez. It is in French also, and he thinks the French translation better than the German. Yours ever truly, H. B. Stowe. Writing in the autumn of 1876 to her son Charles, who was at that time abroad studying at Bonn, Mrs. Stowe describes a most tempestuous passage between New York and Charleston, during which she and her husband and daughters suffered so much that they were ready to forswear the sea forever. The great waves, as they rushed boiling and seething past, would peer in at the little bull's-eye window of the stateroom as if eager to swallow up ship and passengers. From Charleston, however, they had a most delightful run to their journey's end. She writes, quote, "We had a triumphal entrance into the St. John's and a glorious sail up the river. Arriving at Mandarin at 4 o'clock, we found all the neighbors, black as well as white, on the wharf to receive us. There was a great waving of handkerchiefs and flags, clapping of hands and cheering as we drew near. The house was open and all ready for us, and we are delighted to be once more in our beautiful Florida home." End quote. In the following December she writes to her son, quote, "I am again entangled in writing a serial, a thing I never mean to do again, but the story, begun for a mere Christmas brochure, grew so under my hands that I thought I might as well fill it out and make a book of it. It is the last thing of the kind I ever expect to do. In it I condense my recollections of a bygone era, that in which I was brought up, the ways and manners of which are now as nearly obsolete as the old England of Dickens' stories is. I am so hampered by the necessity of writing this story that I am obliged to give up company and visiting of all kinds, and keep my strength for it. I hope I may be able to finish it, as I greatly desire to do so, but I begin to feel that I am not so strong as I used to be. Your mother is an old woman, Charlie mine, and it is best she should give up writing before people are tired of reading her. I would much rather have written another such a book as Footsteps of the Master, but all, even the religious papers, are gone mad on serials. Serials they demand and will have, and I thought, since this generation will listen to nothing but stories, why not tell them?" End quote. The book thus referred to was Pogonock People, that series of delightful reminiscences of the New England life of nearly a century ago that has proved so fascinating to many thousands of readers. It was published in 1878, and as Mrs. Stowe foresaw, was her last literary undertaking of any length, though for several years afterwards she wrote occasional short stories and articles. In January 1879, she wrote from Mandarin to Dr. Holmes, quote, "Dear Doctor, I wish I could give to you and Mrs. Holmes the exquisite charm of this morning. My window is wide open. It is a lovely, fresh, sunny day, and a great orange tree hung with golden balls closes the prospect from my window. The tree is about 30 feet high, and its leaves fairly glisten in the sunshine. I sent Pogonock People to you and Mrs. Holmes as being among the few who know those old days. It is an extremely quiet story for these sensational days when heaven and earth seem to be racked for a thrill, but as I get old I do love to think of those quiet, simple times when there was not a poor person in the parish, and the changing glories of the year were the only spectacle. We, that is, the professor and myself, have been reading with much interest Motley's memoir. That was a man to be proud of, a beauty, too, by your engraving. I never had the pleasure of a personal acquaintance. I feel with you that we have come into the land of leave-taking. Hardly a paper but records the death of some of Mr. Stowe's associates. But the river is not so black as it seems, and there are clear days when the opposite shore is plainly visible, and now and then we catch a strain of music, perhaps even a gesture of recognition. They are thinking of us, without doubt, on the other side. My daughters and I have been reading Elsie Venner again. Elsie is one of my especial friends, poor dear child, and all your theology in that book I subscribe to with both hands. Does not the Bible plainly tell us of a time when there shall be no more pain? That is to be the end and crown of the Messiah's mission, when God shall wipe all tears away. My face is set that way, and yours too, I trust and believe. Mr. Stowe sends hearty and affectionate remembrance both to you and Mrs. Holmes, and I am, as ever, truly yours, H. B. Stowe." About this time Mrs. Stowe paid a visit to her brother Charles at Newport, Florida, and continuing her journey to New Orleans, was made to feel how little of bitterness towards her was felt by the best class of Southerners. In both New Orleans and Tallahassee she was warmly welcomed, and tendered public receptions that gave equal pleasure to her and to the throngs of cultivated people who attended them. She was also greeted everywhere with intense enthusiasm by the colored people, who, whenever they knew of her coming, thronged the railway stations in order to obtain a glimpse of her whom they venerated above all women. The return to her Mandarin home each succeeding winter was always a source of intense pleasure to this true lover of nature in its brightest and tenderest moods. Each recurring season was filled with new delights. In December 1879, she writes to her son, now married and settled as a minister in Saco, Maine, "Dear children, well, we have stepped from December to June, and this morning is sunny and dewy, with a fresh sea breeze giving life to the air. I have just been out to cut a great bunch of roses and lilies, though the garden is grown into such a jungle that I could hardly get about in it. The cannas, the dwarf bananas, the roses are all tangled together, so that I could hardly thread my way among them. I never in my life saw anything range and run rampant over the ground as cannas do. The ground is littered with fallen oranges, and the place looks shockingly untidy, but so beautiful that I am quite willing to forgive its disorder. We got here Wednesday evening about 9 o'clock, and found all the neighbors waiting to welcome us on the wharf. The Meads and Cranes and Webbs and all the rest were there, while the black population was in a frenzy of joy. Your father is quite well. The sea had its usual exhilarating effect upon him. Before we left New York he was quite meek, and exhibited such signs of grace and submission that I had great hopes of him. He promised to do exactly as I told him, and stated that he had entire confidence in my guidance. What woman couldn't call such a spirit evidence of being prepared for speedy translation? I was almost afraid he could not be long for this world. But on the second day at sea his spirits rose, and his appetite reasserted itself. He declared in loud tones how well he felt, and quite resented my efforts to take care of him. I reminded him of his gracious vows and promises in the days of his low spirits, but to no effect. The fact is, his self-will has not left him yet, and I have now no fear of his immediate translation. He is going to preach for us this morning." End quote. The last winter passed in this well-loved Southern home was that of 1883 through 84. For the following season, Professor Stowe's health was in too precarious a state to permit him to undertake the long journey from Hartford. By this time, one of Mrs. Stowe's fondest hopes had been realized, and largely through her efforts, Mandarin had been provided with a pretty little Episcopal church to which was attached a comfortable rectory, and over which was installed a regular clergyman. In January 1884, Mrs. Stowe writes, quote, "Mandarin looks very gay and airy now with its new villas and our new church and rectory. Our minister is perfect. I wish you could know him. He wants only physical strength. In everything else he is all one could ask. It is a bright, lovely morning, and 4 orange pickers are busy gathering our fruit. Our trees on the bluff have done better than any in Florida. This winter I study nothing but Christ's life. First I read Farrar's account and went over it carefully. Now I am reading Geki. It keeps my mind steady and helps me to bear the languor and pain of which I have more than usual this winter." End quote. End of Chapter 17. Read for you by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Chapter 18, Part 1, of the Life of Harriet Beecher Stowe, compiled from her letters and journals by her son Charles Edward Stowe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 18, Oldtown Folks, 1869. Professor Stowe, the original of Harry in Oldtown Folks. Professor Stowe's letter to George Eliot. Her remarks on the same. Professor Stowe's narrative of his youthful adventures in the world of spirits. Professor Stowe's influence on Mrs. Stowe's literary life. George Eliot on Oldtown Folks. This biography would be signally incomplete without some mention of the birth, childhood, early associations, and very peculiar and abnormal psychological experiences of Professor Stowe. Aside from the fact of Dr. Stowe's being Mrs. Stowe's husband, and for this reason entitled to notice in any sketch of her life, however meager, he is the original of the visionary boy in Oldtown Folks, and Oldtown Fireside Stories embody the experiences of his childhood and youth among the grotesque and original characters of his native town. March 26, 1882, Professor Stowe wrote the following characteristic letter to Mrs. Lewes. Mrs. Lewes, I fully sympathize with you in your disgust with Hume and the professing mediums generally. Hume spent his boyhood in my father's native town among my relatives and acquaintances, and he was a disagreeable, nasty boy. But he certainly has qualities which science has not yet explained, and some of his doings are as real as they are strange. My interest in the subject of spiritualism arises from the fact of my own experience more than 60 years ago, in my early childhood. I then never thought of questioning the objective reality of all I saw, and supposed that everybody else had the same experience. Of what this experience was, you may gain some idea from certain passages in Oldtown Folks. The same experiences continue yet, but with serious doubts as to the objectivity of the scenes exhibited. I have noticed that people who have remarkable and minute answers to prayer, such as Stilling, Frank, Lavater, are for the most part of this peculiar temperament. Is it absurd to suppose that some peculiarity in the nervous system, in the connecting link between soul and body, may bring some, more than others, into an almost abnormal contact with the spirit world? For example, Jacob Boehm and Swedenborg? And that, too, without correcting their faults or making them morally better than others. Allow me to say that I have always admired the working of your mind. There is about it such a perfect uprightness and uncalculating honesty. I think you are a better Christian without church or theology than most people are with both, though I am, and always have been in the main, a Calvinist of the Jonathan Edwards school. God bless you. I have a warm side for Mr. Lewes on account of his Goethe labors. Goethe has been my admiration for more than 40 years. In 1830 I got hold of his Faust, and for 2 gloomy, dreary November days, while riding through the woods of New Hampshire in an old-fashioned stagecoach to enter upon a professorship in Dartmouth College, I was perfectly dissolved by it. Sincerely yours, C. E. Stowe. In a letter to Mrs. Stowe, written June 24, 1872, Mrs. Lewes alludes to Professor Stowe's letter as follows. Pray give my special thanks to the professor for his letter. His handwriting, which does really look like Arabic, a very graceful character surely, happens to be remarkably legible to me, and I did not hesitate over a single word. Some of the words, as expressions of fellowship, were very precious to me, and I hold it very good of him to write to me that best sort of encouragement. I was much impressed with the fact, which you have told me, that he was the original of the visionary boy in Oldtown Folks, and it must be deeply interesting to talk with him on his experience. Perhaps I am inclined, under the influence of the facts, physiological and psychological, which have been gathered of late years, to give larger place to the interpretation of vision-seeing as subjective than the professor would approve. It seems difficult to limit, at least to limit with any precision, the possibility of confounding sense by impressions derived from inward conditions with those which are directly dependent on external stimulus. In fact, the division between within and without in this sense seems to become every year a more subtle and bewildering problem." End quote. In 1834, while Mr. Stowe was a professor in Lane Theological Seminary at Cincinnati, Ohio, he wrote out a history of his youthful adventures in the spirit world, from which the following extracts are taken. Quote, I have often thought I would communicate to some scientific physician a particular account of a most singular delusion under which I lived from my earliest infancy till the 15th or 16th year of my age, and the effects of which remain very distinctly now that I am past 30. The facts are of such a nature as to be indelibly impressed upon my mind. They appear to me to be curious and well worth the attention of the psychologist. I regard the occurrences in question as the more remarkable because I cannot discover that I possess either the taste or talent for fiction or poetry. I have barely imagination enough to enjoy, with a high degree of relish, the works of others in this department of literature, but have never felt able or disposed to engage in that sort of writing myself. On the contrary, my style has always been remarkable for its dry, matter-of-fact plainness. My mind has been distinguished for its quickness and adaptedness to historical and literary investigations, for ardor and perseverance in pursuit of the knowledge of facts, ein verständige Richtung, as the Germans would say, rather than for any other quality, and the only talent of a higher kind which I am conscious of possessing is a turn for accurate observation of men and things, and a certain broad humor and drollery. From the hour of my birth I have been constitutionally feeble, as were my parents before me, and my nervous system easily excitable. With care, however, I have kept myself in tolerable health, and my life has been an industrious one, for my parents were poor, and I have always been obliged to labor for my livelihood. With these preliminary remarks, I proceed to the curious details of my psychological history. As early as I can remember anything, I can remember observing a multitude of animated and active objects which I could see with perfect distinctness moving about me, and could sometimes, though seldom, hear them make a rustling noise or other articulate sounds, but I could never touch them. They were in all respects independent of the sense of touch and incapable of being obstructed in any way by the intervention of material objects. I could see them at any distance and through any intervening object with as much ease and distinctness as if they were in the room with me and directly before my eyes. I could see them passing through the floors and the ceilings and the walls of the house from one apartment to another in all directions without a door or a keyhole or crevice being open to admit them. I could follow them with my eyes to any distance or directly through or just beneath the surface or up and down in the midst of boards and timbers and bricks or whatever else would stop the motion or intercept the visibleness of all other objects. These appearances occasioned neither surprise nor alarm, except when they assumed some hideous and frightful form, or exhibited some menacing gesture, for I became acquainted with them as soon as with any of the objects of sense. As to the reality of their existence and the harmlessness of their character, I knew no difference between them and any other of the objects which met my eye. They were as familiar to me as the forms of my parents and my brother. They made up a part of my daily existence, and were as really the subjects of my consciousness as the little bench on which I sat in the corner by my mother's knee, or the wheels and sticks and strings with which I amused myself upon the floor. I indeed recognized a striking difference between them and the things which I could feel and handle, but to me this difference was no more a matter of surprise than that which I observed between my mother and the black woman who so often came to work for her, or between my infant brother and the little spotted dog Brutus, of which I was so fond. There was no time or place or circumstance in which they did not occasionally make their appearance. Solitude and silence, however, were more favorable to their appearance than company and conversation. They were more pleased with candlelight than the daylight. They were most numerous, distinct, and active when I was alone and in the dark, especially when my mother had laid me in bed and returned to her own room with the candle. At such times I always expected the company of my aerial visitors, and counted upon them to amuse me till I dropped asleep. Whenever they failed to make their appearance, as was sometimes the case, I felt lonely and discontented. I kept up a lively conversation with them, not by language or by signs, for the attempts on my part to speak or move would at once break the charm and drive them away in a fret, but by a peculiar sort of spiritual intercommunion. When their attention was directed towards me, I could feel and respond to all their thoughts and feelings, and was conscious that they could in the same manner feel and respond to mine. Sometimes they would take no notice of me, but carry on a brisk conversation among themselves, principally by looks and gestures, and now and then an audible word. In fact, there were but few with whom I was very familiar. These few were much more constant and uniform in their visits than the great multitude, who were frequently changing, and too much absorbed in their own concerns to think much of me. I scarcely know how I can give an idea of their form and general appearance, for there are no objects in the material world with which I can compare them, and no language adapted to an accurate description of their peculiarities. They exhibited all possible combinations of size, shape, proportion, and color, but their most usual appearance was with the human form and proportion, but under a shadowy outline that seemed just ready to melt into the invisible air, and sometimes liable to the most sudden and grotesque changes, and with a uniform darkly bluish color spotted with brown or brownish white. This was the general appearance of the multitude, but there were many exceptions to this description, particularly among my more welcome and familiar visitors, as will be seen in the sequel. Besides these rational and generally harmless beings, there was another set of objects which never varied in their form or qualities, and were always mischievous and terrible. The fact of their appearance depended very much on the state of my health and feelings. If I was well and cheerful, they seldom troubled me, but when sick or depressed, they were sure to obtrude their hateful presence upon me. These were a sort of heavy clouds floating about overhead of a black color, spotted with brown, in the shape of a very flaring inverted tunnel without a nozzle, and from 10 to 30 or 40 feet in diameter. They floated from place to place in great numbers and in all directions, with a strong and steady progress, but with a tremulous, quivering internal motion that agitated them in every part. Whenever they approached, the rational phantoms were thrown into great consternation, as well as might be, for if a cloud touched any part of one of the rational phantoms, it immediately communicated its own color and tremulous motion to the part it touched. In spite of all the efforts and convulsive struggles of the unhappy victim, this color and motion slowly but steadily and uninterruptedly proceeded to diffuse itself over every part of the body, and as fast as it did so, the body was drawn into the cloud and became a part of its substance. It was indeed a fearful sight to see the contortions, the agonizing efforts of the poor creatures who had been touched by one of these awful clouds, and were dissolving and melting into it by inches without the possibility of escape or resistance. This was the only visible object that had the least power over the phantoms, and this was evidently composed of the same material as themselves. The forms and actions of all these phantoms varied very much with the state of my health and animal spirits, but I never could discover that the surrounding material objects had any influence upon them, except in this one particular, namely, if I saw them in a neat, well-furnished room, there was a neatness and polish in their form and motions, and on the contrary, if I was in an unfinished, rough apartment, there was a corresponding rudeness and roughness in my aerial visitors. A corresponding difference was visible when I saw them in the woods or in the meadows, upon the water or upon the ground, in the air or among the stars. Every different apartment which I occupied had a different set of phantoms, and they always had a degree of correspondence to the circumstances in which they were seen. It should be noted, however, that it was not so much the place where the phantoms themselves appeared to me to be that affected their forms and movements, as the place in which I myself actually was while observing them. The apparent locality of the phantoms, it is true, had some influence, but my own actual locality had much more. Thus far I have attempted only a general outline of these curious experiences. I will now proceed to a detailed account of several particular incidents for the sake of illustrating the general statements already made. I select a few from Manifestations Without Number. I am able to ascertain dates from the following circumstances. I was born in April 1802, and my father died in July 1808, after suffering for more than a year from a lingering organic disease. Between 2 and 3 years before his death, he removed from the house in which I was born to another at a little distance from it. What occurred, therefore, before my father's last sickness must have taken place during the first 5 years of my life, and whatever took place before the removal of the family must have taken place during the first 3 years of my life. Before the removal of the family, I slept in a small upper chamber in the front part of the house, where I was generally alone for several hours in the evening and morning. Adjoining this room, and opening into it by a very small door, was a low, dark, narrow, unfinished closet, which was open to the other side into a ruinous old chaise house. This closet was a famous place for the gambols of the phantoms, but of their forms and actions I do not now retain any very distinct recollection. I only remember that I was very careful not to do anything that I thought would be likely to offend them, yet otherwise their presence caused me no uneasiness and was not at all disagreeable to me. The first incident of which I have a distinct recollection was the following. One night, as I was lying alone in my chamber with my little dog Brutus snoring beside my bed, there came out of the closet a very large Indian woman and a very small Indian man, with a huge bass viol between them. The woman was dressed in a large, loose, black gown, secured around her waist by a belt of the same material, and on her head she wore a high, dark gray fur cap, shaped somewhat like a lady's muff, ornamented with a row of covered buttons in front and open towards the bottom, showing a red lining. The man was dressed in a shabby black-colored overcoat and a little round black hat that fitted closely to his head. They took no notice of me, but were rather ill-natured towards each other, and seemed to be disputing for the possession of the bass viol. The man snatched it away and struck upon it a few harsh, hollow notes, which I distinctly heard, and which seemed to vibrate through my whole body with a strange, stinging sensation. The woman then took it and appeared to play very intently, as much to her own satisfaction, but without producing any sound that was perceptible by me. They soon left the chamber, and I saw them go down into the back kitchen, where they sat and played and talked with my mother. It was only when the man took the bow that I could hear the harsh, abrupt, disagreeable sounds of the instrument. At length they arose, went out of the back door, and sprang upon a large heap of straw and unthreshed beans, and disappeared with a strange rumbling sound. This vision was repeated night after night with scarcely any variation while we lived in that house, and once only after the family had removed to the other house. The only thing that seemed to me unaccountable and that excited my curiosity was that there should be such a large heap of straw and beans before the door every night, when I could see nothing of it in the daytime. I frequently crept out of the bed and stole softly down into the kitchen and peeped out of the door to see if it was there very early in the morning. I attempted to make some inquiries of my mother, but as I was not as yet very skillful in the use of language, I could get no satisfaction out of her answers, and could see that my questions seemed to distress her. At first she took little notice of what I said, regarding it, no doubt, as the meaningless prattle of a thoughtless child. My persistence, however, seemed to alarm her, and I suppose that she feared for my sanity. I soon desisted from asking anything further, and shut myself more and more within myself. One night, very soon after the removal, when the house was still and all the family were in bed, these unearthly musicians once made their appearance in the kitchen of the new house, and after looking around peevishly, and sitting with a discontented frown and in silence, they arose and went out of the back door and sprang on a pile of cornstalks, and I saw them no more. Our new dwelling was a low-studded house of only one story, and instead of an upper chamber, I now occupied a bedroom that opened into the kitchen. Within this bedroom, directly on the left hand of the door as you entered from the kitchen, was the staircase which led to the garret, and as the room was unfurnished, some of the boards which enclosed the staircase were too short and left a considerable space between them and the ceiling. One of these open spaces was directly in front of my bed, so that when I lay upon my pillow, my face was opposite to it. Every night, after I had gone to bed and the candle was removed, a very pleasant-looking human face would peer at me over the top of that board, and gradually press forward his head, neck, and shoulders, and finally his whole body as far as the waist, through the opening, and then, smiling upon me with great good nature, would withdraw in the same manner in which he had entered. He was a great favorite of mine, for though we neither of us spoke, we perfectly understood, and were entirely devoted to each other. It is a singular fact that the features of this favorite phantom bore a very close resemblance to those of the boy older than myself, whom I feared and hated. Still the resemblance was so strong that I called him by the same name, Harvey. Harvey's visits were always expected and always pleasant, but sometimes there were visitations of another sort, odious and frightful. One of these I will relate as a specimen of the rest. One night after I had retired to bed and was looking for Harvey, I observed an unusual number of the tunnel-shaped tremulous clouds already described, and they seemed intensely black and strongly agitated. This alarmed me exceedingly, and I had a terrible feeling that something awful was going to happen. It was not long before I saw Harvey at his accustomed place, cautiously peeping at me through the aperture, with an expression of pain and terror on his countenance. He seemed to warn me to be on my guard, but was afraid to put his head into the room, lest he should be touched by one of the clouds, which were every moment growing thicker and more numerous. Harvey soon withdrew and left me alone. On turning my eyes towards the left-hand wall of the room, I thought I saw at an immense distance below me the regions of the damned, as I had heard them pictured in sermons. From this awful world of horror, the tunnel-shaped clouds were ascending, and I perceived that they were the principal instruments of torture in these gloomy abodes. These regions were at such an immense distance below me that I could obtain but a very indistinct view of the inhabitants, who were very numerous and exceedingly active. Near the surface of the earth, and as it seemed to me but a little distance from my bed, I saw 4 or 5 sturdy, resolute devils endeavoring to carry off an unprincipled and dissipated man in the neighborhood by the name of Brown, of whom I had stood in terror for years. These devils, I saw, were very different from the common representations. They had neither red faces, nor horns, nor hoofs, nor tails. They were in all respects stoutly built and well-dressed gentlemen. The only peculiarity that I noted in their appearance was as to their heads. Their faces and necks were perfectly bare, without hair or flesh, and of a uniform sky-blue color, like the ashes of burnt paper before it falls to pieces, and of a certain glossy smoothness. As I looked on, full of eagerness, the devils struggled to force Brown down with them, and Brown struggled with the energy of desperation to save himself from their grip, and it seemed that the human was likely to prove too strong for the infernal. In this emergency, one of the devils, panting for breath and covered with perspiration, beckoned to a strong, thick cloud that seemed to understand him perfectly, and whirling up to Brown, touched his hand. Brown resisted stoutly and struck out right and left at the cloud most furiously, but the usual effect was produced. The hand grew black, quivered, and seemed to be melting into the cloud. Then the arm, by slow degrees, and then the head and shoulders. At this instant, Brown, collecting all his energies for one desperate effort, sprang at once into the center of the cloud, tore it asunder, and descended to the ground, exclaiming, with a hoarse, furious voice that grated on my ear, "There, I've got out. Damn ye if I haven't." This was the first word that had been spoken through the whole horrible scene. It was the first time I had ever seen a cloud fail to produce its appropriate result, and it terrified me so that I trembled from head to foot. The devils, however, did not seem to be in the least discouraged. One of them, who seemed to be the leader, went away and quickly returned, bringing with him an enormous pair of rollers fixed in an iron frame, such as are used in iron mills for the purpose of rolling out and slitting bars of iron, except instead of being turned by machinery, each roller was turned by an immense crank. 3 of the devils now seized Brown and put his feet to the rollers, while 2 others stood, one at each crank, and began to roll him in with a steady strain that was entirely irresistible. Not a word was spoken, not a sound was heard, but the fearful struggles and terrified, agonizing looks of Brown were more than I could endure. I sprang from my bed and ran through the kitchen into the room where my parents slept, and entreated that they would permit me to spend the remainder of the night with them. After considerable parleying, they assured me that nothing could hurt me, and advised me to go back to bed. I replied that I was not afraid of their hurting me, but I couldn't bear to see them acting so with C. Brown. "Pooh-pooh, you foolish boy," replied my father sternly. "You've only been dreaming. Go right back to bed, or I shall have to whip you." Knowing that there was no other alternative, I trudged back through the kitchen with all the courage I could muster, cautiously entered my room, where I found everything quiet, there being neither cloud, nor devil, nor anything of the kind to be seen, and getting into bed, I slept quietly till morning. The next day I was rather sad and melancholy, but kept all my troubles to myself through fear of Mr. Brown. This happened before my father's sickness, and consequently between the 4 and 6 years of my age. During my father's sickness and after his death, I lived with my grandmother, and when I had removed to her house, I forever lost sight of Harvey. I still continued to sleep alone for the most part, but in a neatly furnished upper chamber. Across the corner of the chamber, opposite to and a little distant from the head of my bed, there was a closet in the form of an old-fashioned buffet. After going to bed, on looking at the door of this closet, I could see at a great distance from it a pleasant meadow, terminated by a beautiful little grove. Out of this grove and across this meadow, a charming little female figure would advance, about 8 inches high and exquisitely proportioned, dressed in a loose black silk robe, with long, smooth, black hair parted up her head and hanging loose over her shoulders. She would come forward with a slow and regular step, becoming more distinctly visible as she approached nearer, till she came even with the surface of the closet door, when she would smile upon me, raise her hands to her head and draw them down on each side of her face, suddenly turn around and go off at a rapid trot. The moment she turned, I could see a good-looking mulatto man, rather smaller than herself, following directly in her wake and trotting off after her. This was generally repeated 2 or 3 times before I went to sleep. The features of the mulatto bore some resemblance to those of the Indian man with the bass viol, but were much more mild and agreeable. End of Chapter 18, Part 1. Read for you by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Chapter 18, Part 2 of The Life of Harriet Beecher Stowe, compiled from her letters and journals by her son Charles Edward Stowe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 18, Oldtown Folks, 1869, Part 2. I awoke one bright moonlit night and found a large, full-length human skeleton of an ashy blue color in bed with me. I screamed out with fright and soon summoned the family around me. I refused to tell the cause of my alarm, but begged permission to occupy another bed, which was granted. For the remainder of the night I slept but little, but I saw upon the window-stool companies of little fairies, about 6 inches high, in white robes, gambolling and dancing with incessant merriment. 2 of them, a male and female, rather taller than the rest, were dignified with a crown and scepter. They took the kindest note of me, smiled upon me with great benignity, and seemed to assure me of their protection. I was soothed and cheered by their presence, though after all there was a sort of sinister and selfish expression in their countenances which prevented my placing implicit confidence in them. Up to this time I had never doubted the real existence of these phantoms, nor had I ever suspected that other people had not seen them as distinctly as myself. I now, however, began to discover with no little anxiety that my friends had little or no knowledge of the aerial beings among whom I spent my whole life, that my allusions with them were not understood, and all complaints respecting them were laughed at. I had never been disposed to say much about them, and the discovery confirmed me in my silence. It did not, however, affect my own belief, or lead me to suspect that my imaginations were not realities. During the whole of this period I took great pleasure in walking out alone, particularly in the evening. The most lonely fields, the woods, and the banks of the river, and other places most completely secluded, were my favorite resorts, for there I could enjoy the sight of innumerable aerial beings of all sorts without interruption. Every object, even every shaking leaf, seemed to me to be animated by some living soul, whose nature in some degree corresponded to its habitation. I spent much of my life in these solitary rambles. There were particular places to which I gave names, and visited them at regular intervals. Moonlight was particularly agreeable to me, but most of all I enjoyed a thick, foggy night. At times during these walks I would be excessively obsessed by an indefinite and deep feeling of melancholy. Without knowing why, I would be so unhappy as to wish myself annihilated. And suddenly it would occur to me that my friends at home were suffering some dreadful calamity, and so vivid would be the impression that I would hasten home with all speed to see what had taken place. At such seasons I felt a morbid love for my friends that would almost burn upon my soul, and yet at the least provocation from them I would fly into an uncontrollable passion and foam like a little fury. I was called a dreadful-tempered boy, but the Lord knows that I never occasioned pain to any animal, whether human or brute, without suffering untold agonies in consequence of it. I cannot even now, without feelings of deep sorrow, call to mind the alternate fits of corroding melancholy, irritation, and bitter remorse which I then endured. These fits of melancholy were most constant and oppressive during the autumnal months. I very early learned to read, and soon became immoderately attached to books. In the Bible, I read the first chapters of Job and parts of Ezekiel, Daniel, and Revelation with most intense delight, and with such frequency that I could repeat large portions from memory long before the age at which boys in the country are usually able to read plain sentences. The first large book besides the Bible that I remember reading was Morse's History of New England, which I devoured with insatiable greediness, particularly those parts which relate to Indian wars and witchcraft. I was in the habit of applying to my grandmother for explanations, and she would relate to me, while I listened with breathless attention, long stories from Mather's Magnalia, or Magnilli as she used to call it, a work which I earnestly longed to read, but of which I never got sight till after my 20th year. Very early there fell into my hands an old school book called The Art of Speaking, containing numerous extracts from Milton and Shakespeare. There was little else in the book that interested me, but these extracts from the two great English poets, though there were many things in them that I did not well understand, I read again and again, with increased pleasure at every perusal, till I had nearly committed them to memory, and almost thumbed the old book into nonentity. But of all the books that I read at this period, there was none that went to my heart like Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. I read it and reread it night and day. I took it to bed with me and hugged it to my bosom while I slept. Every different edition that I could find I seized upon and read with as eager a curiosity as if it had been a new story throughout. And I read with the unspeakable satisfaction of most devoutly believing that everything which honest John related was a real verity, an actual occurrence. Oh, that I could read that most inimitable book once more with the same solemn conviction of its literal truth, that I might once more enjoy the same untold ecstasy. One other remark that seems proper to make before I proceed further to details. The appearance, and especially the motions of my aerial visitors, were intimately connected, either as cause or effect, I cannot determine which, with certain sensations of my own. Their countenances generally expressed pleasure or pain, complacence or anger, according to the mood of my own mind. If they moved from place to place without moving their limbs, with that gliding motion appropriate to spirits, I felt in my stomach that peculiar tickling sensation which accompanies a rapid progressive movement through the air, and if they went off with an uneasy trot, I felt an unpleasant jarring through my frame. Their appearance was always attended with considerable effort and fatigue on my part. The more distinct and vivid they were, the more would my fatigue be increased, and at such times my face was always pale, and my eyes unusually sparkling and wild. This continued to be the case after I became satisfied that it was all a delusion of the imagination, and it so continues to the present day." End quote. It is not surprising that Mrs. Stowe should have felt herself impelled to give literary form to an experience so exceptional. Still more must this be the case when the early associations of this exceptional character were as amusing and interesting as they are shown forth in Oldtown fireside stories. None of the incidents or characters embodied in those sketches are ideal. The stories are told as they came from Mr. Stowe's lips, with little or no alteration. Sam Lawson was a real character. In 1874, Mr. Whittier wrote to Mrs. Stowe, quote, "I am not able to write or study much or read books that require thought without suffering, but I have Sam Lawson lying at hand, and as Corporal Trim said of Yorick's sermon, I like it hugely." End quote. The power and literary value of these stories lie in the fact that they are true to nature. Professor Stowe was himself an inimitable mimic and storyteller. No small portion of Mrs. Stowe's success as a literary woman is to be attributed to him. Not only was he possessed of a bright, quick mind, but wonderful retentiveness of memory. Mrs. Stowe was never at a loss for reliable information on any subject as long as the professor lived. He belonged to that extinct species, the general scholar. His scholarship was not critical in the modern sense of the word, but in the main accurate, in spite of his love for the marvelous. It is not out of place to give a little idea of his power in character painting, as it shows how suggestive his conversation and letters must have been to a mind like that of Mrs. Stowe's. Natick, July 14, 1839. I have had a real good time this week writing my oration. I have strolled over my old walking places and found the same old stone walls, the same old footpaths through the rye fields, the same bends in the river, the same old bullfrogs with their green spectacles on, the same old terrapins sticking up their heads and bowing as I go by, and nothing was wanting but my wife to talk with to make all complete. I have had some rare talks with old Uncle Jaw Bacon and other old characters, which you ought to have heard. The Curtises have been flooding Uncle Jaw's meadows, and he is in a great stew about it. He says, quote, I took and telled your Uncle Isaac to tell them Mary Curtises that if the devil didn't get 'em for flowering my medder out of that sort, I didn't see no use of having any devil. End quote. Have you talked with the Curtises yourself? Yes, hang the scary dogs, and they took and telled me that they'd take and flow clean up to my front door and make me go out and in a boat. Why don't you go to the law? Oh, they keep alterin' and a-tinkerin' up them laws so here in Massachusetts that a body can't get no damage for flowin'. They think cold water can't hurt nobody. End quote. Mother and Aunt Nabby each keep separate establishments. First, Aunt Nabby gets up in the morning and examines the sink to see whether it leaks and rots the beam. She then makes a little fire, gets her a little teapot of bright shining tin, and puts into it a teaspoon of black tea, and so prepares her breakfast. By this time, Mother comes creeping downstairs like an old tabby cat out of an ash hole, and she kind of doubts and reckons whether or no she had better try to get any breakfast, being as she has not much appetite this morning, but she goes to the leg of bacon and cuts off a little slice, reckons she'll broil it, then goes and looks at the coffee pot and reckons she'll have a little coffee, don't exactly know whether it's good for her, but she don't drink much. So while Aunt Nabby is sitting sipping her tea and munching her bread and butter with a matter-of-fact certainty and marvelous satisfaction, Mother goes doubting and reckoning round, like Miss Diffidence in Doubting Castle, till you see rising up another little table in another corner of the room with a good substantial structure of broiled ham and coffee and a boiled egg or two, with various et ceteras, which Mrs. Diffidence, after many desponding ejaculations, finally sits down to, and in spite of all presentiments makes them fly as nimbly as Mr. Ready-to-Halt did Miss Much-Afraid when he footed it so well with her on his crutches in the dance on the occasion of Giant Despair's overthrow. I have thus far dined alternately with Mother and Aunt Susan, not having yet been admitted to Aunt Nabby's establishment. There are now great talkings and congresses and consultations of the allied powers, and already rumors are afloat that perhaps all will unite their force and dine at one table, especially as Harriet and little Hattie are coming, and there is no knowing what might come out in the papers if there should be anything a little odd. Mother is very well, thin as a hatchet and smart as a steel trap. Aunt Nabby fat and easy as usual, for since the sink is mended and no longer leaks and rots the beam, she has nothing to do but watch it, and Uncle Bill has joined the Washingtonians and no longer drinks rum. She is quite at a loss for topics of worriment. Uncle Ike has had a little touch of palsy and is rather feeble. He says that his legs and arms have rather gi'n out, but his head and pluck are as good as they ever were. I told him that our sister Kate was very much in the same fix, whereat he was considerably affected, and opened the crack in his great pumpkin of a face, displaying the same 2 rows of great white ivories which have been my admiration from my youth up. He is 65 years of age and has never lost a tooth, and was never in his life more than 15 miles from the spot where he was born, except once in the ever memorable year of 1819, when I was at Bradford Academy. In a sudden glow of adventurous rashness, he undertook to go after me and bring me home for vacation, and he actually performed the whole journey of 30 miles with his horse and wagon, and slept at a tavern the whole night, a feat of bravery on which he has never since ceased to plume himself. I well remember that awful night in the tavern in the remote region of North Andover. We occupied a chamber in which were 2 beds. In the unsuspecting innocence of youth, I undressed myself and got into bed as usual, but my brave and thoughtful uncle, merely divesting himself of his coat, put it under his pillow, and then threw himself onto the bed with his boots on his feet and his 2 hands resting on the rim of his hat, which he had prudently placed on the apex of his stomach as he lay on his back. He wouldn't allow me to blow out the candle, but he lay there with his great white eyes fixed on the ceiling in the cool, determined manner of a bold man who has made up his mind to face danger and meet whatever might befall him. We escaped, however, without injury, the doughty landlord and his relentless sons merely demanding pay for supper, lodging, horse-feed, and breakfast, which my valiant uncle, betraying no signs of fear, resolutely paid." End quote. Mrs. Stowe has woven this incident into Chapter 32 of Oldtown Folks, where Uncle Ike figures as Uncle Jacob. Mrs. Stowe had misgivings as to the reception Oldtown Folks would meet in England, owing to its distinctly New England character. Shortly after the publication of the book, she receives the following words of encouragement from Mrs. Lewes, George Eliot, July 11, 1869. Quote, "I have received and read Oldtown Folks. I think that few of your readers can have felt more interest than I have felt in that picture of an elder generation, for my interest in it has a double root. One is my own love for our old-fashioned provincial life, which had its affinities with a contemporary life, even all across the Atlantic, and of which I have gathered glimpses in different phases from my mother and father, with their relations. The other is my experimental acquaintance with some shades of Calvinistic orthodoxy. I think your way of presenting the religious convictions which are not your own, except by way of indirect fellowship, is a triumph of insight and true tolerance. Both Mr. Lewes and I are deeply interested in the indications which the professor gives of his peculiar psychological experience, and we should feel it a great privilege to learn much more of it from his lips. It is a rare thing to have such an opportunity of studying exceptional experience in the testimony of a truthful and in every way distinguished mind." End quote. Oldtown Folks is of interest as being undoubtedly the last of Mrs. Stowe's works which will outlive the generation for which it was written. Besides its intrinsic merit as a work of fiction, it has a certain historic value as being a faithful study of New England life and character in that particular time of its history which may be called the seminal period. Whether Mrs. Stowe was far enough away from the time and people she attempts to describe to make her mind as still and passive as a looking-glass or a mountain lake, and to give merely the images reflected there, is something that will in great part determine the permanent value of this work. Its interest as a story merely is, of course, ephemeral. This ends Chapter 18. Read for you by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Chapter 19 of the Life of Harriet Beecher Stowe, compiled from her letters and journals by her son Charles Edward Stowe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 19, The Byron Controversy, 1869 through 1870. Mrs. Stowe's statement of her own case, the circumstances under which she first met Lady Byron, letters to Lady Byron, letter to Dr. Holmes when about to publish the true story of Lady Byron's life in the Atlantic, Dr. Holmes's reply, the conclusion of the matter. It seems impossible to avoid the unpleasant episode in Mrs. Stowe's life known as the Byron Controversy. It will be our effort to deal with the matter as colorlessly as is consistent with an adequate setting forth of the motives which moved Mrs. Stowe to awaken this unsavory discussion. In justification of her action in this matter, Mrs. Stowe says, "What interest have you and I, my brother and my sister, in this short life of ours, to utter anything but the truth? Is not truth between man, and between man and woman, the foundation on which all things rest? Have you not, every individual of you, who must hereafter give an account of yourself alone to God, an interest to know the exact truth in this matter, and a duty to perform as respects that truth? Hear me, then, while I tell you the position in which I stood and what was my course in relation to it. A shameless attack on my friend's memory had appeared in the Blackwood of July 1869, branding Lady Byron as the vilest of criminals and recommending the Guiccioli book to a Christian public as interesting from the very fact that it was the avowed product of Lord Byron's mistress. No efficient protest was made against this outrage in England, and Littell's Living Age reprinted the Blackwood article, and the Harpers, the largest publishing house in America, perhaps in the world, republished the book. Its statements, with those of the Blackwood, Pall Mall Gazette, and other English periodicals, were being propagated through all the young reading and writing world of America. I was meeting them advertised in dailies and made up into articles in magazines, and thus the generation of today, who had no means of judging Lady Byron but by these fables of her slanders, were being foully deceived. The friends who knew her personally were a small, select circle in England, whom death is every day reducing. They were few in number compared with the great world, and were silent. I saw these foul slanders crystallizing into history, uncontradicted by friends who knew her personally, who, firm in their own knowledge of her virtues and limited in view as aristocratic circles generally are, had no idea of the width of the world they were living in and the exigency of the crisis. When time passed on and no voice was raised, I spoke." End quote. It is hardly necessary to recapitulate at any great length facts already so familiar to the reading public. It may be sufficient simply to say that after the appearance in 1868 of the Countess Guiccioli's Recollections of Lord Byron, Mrs. Stowe felt herself called upon to defend the memory of her friend from what she esteemed to be falsehoods and slanders. To accomplish this object, she prepared for the Atlantic Monthly of September 1869 an article, "The True Story of Lady Byron's Life." Speaking of her first impressions of Lady Byron, Mrs. Stowe says, "I formed her acquaintance in the year 1853 during my first visit to England. I met her at a lunch party in the house of one of her friends. When I was introduced to her, I felt in a moment the words of her husband, quote, 'There was awe in the homage that she drew. Her spirit seemed as seated on a throne.'" It was in the fall of 1856, on the occasion of Mrs. Stowe's second visit to England, as she and her sister were on their way to Eversley to visit the Reverend C. Kingsley, that they stopped by invitation to lunch with Lady Byron at her summer residence at Ham Common, near Richmond. At that time, Lady Byron informed Mrs. Stowe that it was her earnest desire to receive a visit from her on her return, as there was a subject of great importance concerning which she desired her advice. Mrs. Stowe has thus described this interview with Lady Byron. "After lunch, I retired with Lady Byron, and my sister remained with her friends. I should here remark that the chief subject of the conversation which ensued was not entirely new to me. In the interval between my first and second visits to England, a lady who for many years had enjoyed Lady Byron's friendship and confidence had, with her consent, stated the case generally to me, giving some of the incidents, so that I was in a manner prepared for what followed. Those who accuse Lady Byron of being a person fond of talking upon this subject and apt to make unconsidered confidences can have known very little of her reserve, and of the apparent difficulty she had in speaking on subjects nearest her heart. Her habitual calmness and composure of manner, her collected dignity on all occasions, are often mentioned by her husband, sometimes with bitterness, sometimes with admiration. He says, quote, "Though I accuse Lady Byron of an excess of self-respect, I must in candor admit that, if ever a person had excuse for an extraordinary portion of it, she has, as in all her thoughts, words, and deeds, she is the most decorous woman that ever existed, and must appear, what few I fancy could, a perfectly refined gentlewoman, even in her femme de chambre." End quote. This calmness and dignity were never more manifested than in this interview. In recalling the conversation at this distance of time, I cannot remember all the language used. Some particular words and forms of expression I do remember, and those I give, and in other cases I give my recollection of the substance of what was said. There was something awful to me in the intensity of repressed emotion which she showed as she proceeded. The great fact upon which all turned was stated in words that were unmistakable. Mrs. Stowe goes on to give minutely Lady Byron's conversation, and concludes by saying, quote, "Of course I did not listen to this story as one who was investigating its worth. I received it as truth, and the purpose for which it was communicated was not to enable me to prove it to the world, but to ask my opinion whether she should show it to the world before leaving it. The whole consultation was upon the assumption that she had at her command such proofs as could not be questioned. Concerning what they were I did not minutely inquire, only in answer to a general question she said that she had letters and documents in proof of her story. Knowing Lady Byron's strength of mind, her clear-headedness, her accurate habits, and her perfect knowledge of the matter, I considered her judgment on this point decisive. I told her that I would take the subject into consideration and give my opinion in a few days. That night, after my sister and myself had retired to our own apartment, I related to her the whole history, and we spent the night in talking it over. I was powerfully impressed with the justice and propriety of an immediate disclosure, while she, on the contrary, represented the fatal consequences that would probably come upon Lady Byron from taking such a step. Before we parted the next day, I requested Lady Byron to give me some memoranda of such dates and outlines of the general story as would enable me better to keep it in its connection, which she did. On giving me the paper, Lady Byron requested me to return it to her when it had ceased to be of use to me for the purpose intended. Accordingly, a day or two after, I enclosed it to her in a hasty note, as I was then leaving London for Paris, and had not yet had time fully to consider the subject. On reviewing my note, I can recall that then the whole history appeared to me like one of those singular cases where unnatural impulses to vice are the result of a taint of constitutional insanity. This has always seemed to me the only way of accounting for instances of utterly motiveless and abnormal wickedness and cruelty. These, my first impressions, were expressed in the hasty note written at the time. London, November 5th, 1856. Dearest friend, I return these. They have held mine eyes waking. How strange! How unaccountable! Have you ever subjected the facts to the judgment of a medical man learned in nervous pathology? Is it not insanity? Great wits to madness nearly are allied, and thin partitions do their bounds divide. But my purpose tonight is not to write to you fully what I think of this matter. I am going to write to you from Paris more at leisure. The rest of the letter was taken up in the final details of a charity in which Lady Byron had been engaged with me in assisting an unfortunate artist. It concludes thus. I write now in all haste en route for Paris. As to America, all is not lost yet. Farewell. I love you, my dear friend, as never before, with an intense feeling that I cannot easily express. God bless you. H.B.S. The next letter is as follows. Paris, December 17th, 1856. Dear Lady Byron, the Kansas Committee have written me a letter desiring me to express to Miss Blank their gratitude for the £5 she sent them. I am not personally acquainted with her, and must return these acknowledgments through you. I wrote you a day or two since, enclosing the reply of the Kansas Committee to you. On that subject on which you spoke to me the last time we were together, I have thought often and deeply. I have changed my mind somewhat. Considering the peculiar circumstances of the case, I could wish that the sacred veil of silence, so bravely thrown over the past, should never be withdrawn during the time that you remain with us. I would say then, leave all with some discreet friends, who, after both have passed from earth, shall say what was due to justice. I am led to think this by seeing how low, how unworthy the judgments of this world are, and I would not that what I so much respect, love, and revere should be placed within the reach of its harpy claw, which pollutes what it touches. The day will yet come which will bring to light every hidden thing. There is nothing covered that shall not be revealed, neither hid that shall not be known, and so justice will not fail. Such, my dear friend, are my thoughts, different from what they were since first I heard that strange, sad history. Meanwhile, I love you forever, whether we meet again on earth or not. Affectionately yours, H.B.S. Before her article appeared in print, Mrs. Stowe addressed the following letter to Dr. Holmes in Boston. Hartford, June 26, 1869. Dear Doctor, I am going to ask help of you, and I feel that confidence in your friendship that leads me to be glad that I have a friend like you to ask advice of. In order that you may understand fully what it is, I must go back some years and tell you about it. When I went to England the first time, I formed a friendship with Lady Byron, which led to a somewhat interesting correspondence. When there the second time, after the publication of Dread in 1856, Lady Byron wrote to me that she wished to have some private confidential conversation with me, and invited me to come spend a day with her at her country seat near London. I went, met her alone, and spent an afternoon with her. The object of the visit she then explained to me. She was in such a state of health that she considered she had very little time to live, and was engaged in those duties and reviews which every thoughtful person finds who is coming deliberately and with their eyes open to the boundaries of this mortal life. Lady Byron, as you must perceive, has all her life lived under the weight of slanders and false imputations laid upon her by her husband. Her own side of the story has been told only to that small circle of confidential friends who needed to know it in order to assist her in meeting the exigencies which it imposed on her. Of course, it has thrown the sympathy mostly on his side, since the world generally has more sympathy with impulsive incorrectness than with strict justice. At that time there was a cheap edition of Byron's works in contemplation, meant to bring them into circulation among the masses, and the pathos arising from the story of his domestic misfortunes was one great means relied on for giving it currency. Under these circumstances, some of Lady Byron's friends had proposed the question to her whether she had not a responsibility to society for the truth, whether she did right to allow these persons to gain influence over the popular mind by a silent consent to an utter falsehood. As her whole life had been passed in the most heroic self-abnegation and self-sacrifice, the question was now proposed to her whether one more act of self-denial was not required of her, namely, to declare the truth, no matter at what expense to her own feelings. For this purpose, she told me she wished to recount the whole story to a person in whom she had confidence, a person of another country, and out of the whole sphere of personal and local feelings, which might be supposed to influence those in the country and station in life where the events really happened, in order that I might judge whether anything more was required of her in relation to this history. The interview had almost the solemnity of a deathbed confession, and Lady Byron told me the history which I have embodied in an article to appear in the Atlantic Monthly. I have been induced to prepare it by the run which the Guiccioli book is having, which is from first to last an unsparing attack on Lady Byron's memory by Lord Byron's mistress. When you have read my article, I want not your advice as to whether the main facts shall be told, for on this point I am so resolved that I frankly say advice would do me no good. But you might help me, with your delicacy and insight, to make the manner of telling more perfect, and I want to do it as wisely and well as such story can be told. My post-office address after July 1st will be Westport Point, Bristol County, Massachusetts, care of Mrs. I. M. Soule. The proof sheets will be sent you by the publisher. Very truly yours, H. B. Stowe. In reply to the storm of controversy aroused by the publication of this article, Mrs. Stowe made a more extended effort to justify the charges which she had brought against Lord Byron in a work published in 1869, Lady Byron Vindicated. Immediately after the publication of this work, she mailed a copy to Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes, accompanied by the following note. Boston, May 19, 1869. Dear Doctor, in writing this book, which I now take the liberty of sending to you, I have been in a critical place. It has been a strange, weird sort of experience, and I have had not a word to say to anybody, though often thinking of you and wishing I could have a little of your help and sympathy in getting out what I saw. I think of you very much, and rejoice to see the hold your works get on England as well as this country, and I would give more for your opinion than that of most folks. How often I have pondered your last letter to me, and sent it to many friends. God bless you. Please accept for yourself and your good wife this copy. From yours truly, H.B. Stowe. Mrs. Stowe also published in 1870, through Sampson Low and Son of London, a volume for English readers, The History of the Byron Controversy. These additional volumes, however, do not seem to have satisfied the public as a whole, and perhaps the expediency of the publication of Mrs. Stowe's first article is doubtful, even to her most ardent admirers. The most that can be hoped for through the mention of this subject in this biography is the vindication of Mrs. Stowe's purity of motive and nobility of intention in bringing this painful matter into notice. While she was being on all hands, effectively and evidently in some quarters with rare satisfaction, roundly abused for the article, and her consequent responsibility in bringing this unsavory discussion so prominently before the public mind, she received the following letter from Dr. O.W. Holmes. Boston, September 25, 1869. My dear Mrs. Stowe, I have been meaning to write to you for some time, but in the midst of all the wild and virulent talk about the article in the Atlantic, I felt as if there was little to say until the first fury of the storm had blown over. I think that we all perceive now that the battle is not to be fought here, but in England. I have listened to a good deal of talk, always taking your side in a quiet way, backed very heartily on one occasion by one of my most intellectual friends, reading all that came in my way, and watching the course of opinion. At first it was to be expected that the Guiccioli fanciers would resent any attack on Lord Byron, and would highly relish the opportunity of abusing one who, like yourself, had been identified with all those moral enterprises which elevate the standard of humanity at large, and of womanhood in particular. After this scum had worked itself off, there must necessarily follow a controversy, none the less sharp and bitter, but not depending essentially on abuse. The first point the recusants got hold of was the error of the 2 years which contrived to run the gauntlet of so many pairs of eyes. Some of them were made happy by mouthing and shaking this between their teeth, as a poodle tears round with a glove. This did not last long. No sensible person could believe for a moment you were mistaken in the essential character of a statement, every word of which would fall on the ear of a listening friend like a drop of melted lead, and burn its scar deep into the memory. That Lady Byron believed and told you the story will not be questioned by any but fools and malignants. Whether her belief was well-founded, there may be positive evidence in existence to show affirmatively. The fact that her statement is not peremptorily contradicted by those most likely to be acquainted with the facts of the case is the one result so far which is forcing itself into unwilling recognition. I have seen nothing in the various hypotheses brought forward which did not to me involve a greater improbability than the presumption of guilt. Take that for witness that Byron accused himself, through a spirit of perverse vanity, of crimes he had not committed. How preposterous! He would stain the name of a sister, whom, on the supposition of his innocence, he loved with angelic ardor as well as purity, by associating it with an infamous accusation. Suppose there are some anomalies hard to explain in Lady Byron's conduct. Could a young and guileless woman, in the hands of such a man, be expected to act in any given way, or would she not be likely to waver, to doubt, to hope, to contradict herself in the anomalous position in which, without experience, she found herself? As to the intrinsic evidence contained in the poems, I think it confirms rather than contradicts the hypothesis of guilt. I do not think that Butler's argument and all the other attempts at invalidation of the story avail much in the face of the acknowledged fact that it was told to various competent and honest witnesses and remains without a satisfactory answer from those most interested. I know your firm self-reliance and your courage to proclaim the truth when any good end is to be served by it. It is to be expected that public opinion will be more or less divided as to the expediency of this revelation. Hoping that you have recovered from your indisposition, I am faithfully yours, O. W. Holmes. While undergoing the most unsparing and pitiless criticism and brutal insult, Mrs. Stowe received the following sympathetic words from Mrs. Lewes, George Eliot. The Priory, 21 North Bank, December 10, 1869. My dear friend, in the midst of your trouble I was often thinking of you, for I feared that you were undergoing a considerable trial from the harsh and unfair judgments, partly the fruit of hostility, glad to find an opportunity for venting itself, and partly of that unthinking cruelty which belongs to hasty, anonymous journalism. For my own part, I should have preferred that the Byron question should never have been brought before the public, because I think the discussion of such subjects is injurious socially. But with regard to yourself, dear friend, I feel sure that in acting on a different basis of impressions, you were impelled by pure, generous feeling. Do not think that I would have written to you of this point to express a judgment. I am anxious only to convey to you a sense of my sympathy and confidence, such as a kiss and a pressure of the hand could give if I were near you. I trust that I shall hear a good account of Professor Stowe's health, as well as your own, whenever you have time to write me a word or two. I shall not be so unreasonable as to expect a long letter, for the hours of needful rest from writing become more and more precious as the years go on, but some brief news of you and yours will be especially welcome just now. Mr. Lewes unites with me in high regards to your husband and yourself, but in addition to that, I have the sister woman's privilege of saying that I am always your affectionate friend, M. H. Lewes. End of Chapter 19, read for you by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Chapter 20, Part 1 of the Life of Harriet Beecher Stowe, compiled from her letters and journals by her son Charles Edward Stowe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 20, George Eliot, Part 1. Correspondence with George Eliot, George Eliot's first impressions of Mrs. Stowe, Mrs. Stowe's letter to Mrs. Follen, George Eliot's letter to Mrs. Stowe, Mrs. Stowe's reply, Life in Florida, Robert Dale Owen and Modern Spiritualism, George Eliot's letter on the phenomena of spiritualism, Mrs. Stowe's description of scenery in Florida, Mrs. Stowe concerning Middlemarch, George Eliot to Mrs. Stowe during Reverend H. W. Beecher's trial, Mrs. Stowe concerning her life experience with her brother H. W. Beecher and his trial, Mrs. Lewes' last letter to Mrs. Stowe, diverse mental characteristics of these two women, Mrs. Stowe's final estimate of modern spiritualism. It is with a feeling of relief that we turn from one of the most disagreeable experiences of Mrs. Stowe's life to one of the most delightful, namely, the warm friendship of one of the most eminent women of this age, George Eliot. There seems to have been some deep affinity of feeling that drew them closely together in spite of diversity of intellectual tastes. George Eliot's attention was first personally attracted to Mrs. Stowe in 1853 by means of a letter which the latter had written to Mrs. Follen. Speaking of this incident, George Eliot, writes, quote, Mrs. Follen showed me a delightful letter which she has just had from Mrs. Stowe, telling all about herself. She begins by saying, I am a little bit of a woman, rather more than 40, as withered and dry as a pinch of snuff, never very well worth looking at in my best days, and now a decidedly used-up article. The whole letter is most fascinating and makes one love her. Footnote from George Eliot's Life, edited by J.W. Cross, Volume 1. End of footnote. The correspondence between these two notable women was begun by Mrs. Stowe and called forth the following extremely interesting letter from the distinguished English novelist. The Priory, 21 North Bank, May 8, 1869. My dear friend, I value very highly the warrant to call you friend which your letter has given me. It lay awaiting me on our return the other night from a 9-week absence in Italy, and it made me almost wish that you could have a momentary vision of the discouragement, nay, paralyzing despondency, in which many days of my writing life have been passed, in order that you might fully understand the good I find in such sympathy as yours, in such an assurance as you give me that my work has been worth doing. But I will not dwell on any mental sickness of mine. The best joy your words give me is the sense of that sweet, generous feeling in which you dictated them. I shall always be the richer because you have in this way made me know you better. I must tell you that my first glimpse of you as a woman came through a letter of yours and charmed me very much. The letter was addressed to Mrs. Follen, and one morning I called on her in London, how many years ago, and she was kind enough to read it to me because it contained a little history of your life and a sketch of your domestic circumstances. I remember thinking that it was very kind of you to write that long letter in reply to inquiries of one who was personally unknown to you, and looking back with my present experience, I think it was kinder than it then appeared, for at that moment you must have been much oppressed with the immediate results of your fame. I remember, too, that you wrote of your husband as one who was richer in Hebrew and Greek than in pounds or shillings, and as an ardent scholar has always been a character of peculiar interest to me, I have rarely had your image in mind without the accompanying image, more or less erroneous, of such a scholar by your side. I shall welcome the fruit of his Goethe studies whenever it comes. I have good hopes that your fears are groundless as to the obstacles your new book, Oldtown Folks, may find here from its thorough American character. Most readers who are likely to be really influenced by writing above the common order will find that special aspect an added reason for interest and study. And I dare say you have long seen, as I am beginning to see with new clearness, that if a book which has any sort of exquisiteness happens also to be a popular, widely circulated book, the power over the social mind for any good is, after all, due to its reception by a few appreciative natures, and is the slow result of radiation from that narrow circle. I mean that you can affect a few souls, and that each of these in turn may affect a few more, but that no exquisite book tells properly and directly on a multitude, however largely it may spread by type and paper. Witness the things the multitude will say about it, if one is so unhappy as to be obliged to hear their sayings. I do not write this cynically, but in pure sadness and pity. Both traveling abroad and staying home among our English sights and sports, how slowly the centuries work toward the moral good of men, and that thought lies very close to what you say as to your wonder or conjecture concerning my religious point of view. I believe that religion, too, has to be modified according to the dominant phases, that a religion more perfect than any yet prevalent must express less care of personal consolation and a more deeply awing sense of responsibility to man, springing from sympathy with that which of all things is most certainly known to us, the difficulty of the human lot. Letters are necessarily narrow and fragmentary, and when one writes on wide subjects are likely to create more misunderstanding than illumination. But I have little anxiety in writing to you, dear friend and fellow laborer, for you have had longer experience than I as a writer, and fuller experience as a woman, since you have borne children and known a mother's history from the beginning. I trust your quick and long-taught mind as an interpreter little liable to mistake me. When you say, quote, "We live in an orange grove and are planting many more," and when I think you must have abundant family love to cheer you, it seems to me that you must have a paradise about you. But no list of circumstances will make a paradise. Nevertheless, I must believe that the joyous, tender humor of your books clings about your more immediate life and makes some of that sunshine for yourself which you have given to us. I see the advertisement of Oldtown Folks and shall eagerly expect it. That and every other new link between us will be reverentially valued. With great devotion and regard, yours always, M. L. Lewes. Mrs. Stowe writes from Mandarin to George Eliot. Mandarin, February 8th, 1872. Dear friend, it is 2 years nearly since I had your last very kind letter, and I have never answered, because 2 years of constant and severe work have made it impossible to give a drop to anything beyond the needs of the hour. Yet I have always thought of you, loved you, trusted you all the same, and read every little scrap from your writing that came to hand. One thing brings you back to me. I am now in Florida in my little hut in the orange orchard, with the broad expanse of the blue St. John's in front, and the waving of the live oaks, with their long gray mosses overhead, and the bright gold of oranges looking through dusky leaves around. It is like Sorrento, so like that I can quite dream of being there. And when I get here I enter another life. The world recedes. I am out of it. It ceases to influence. Its bustle and noise die away in the far distance. And here is no winter, an open-air life, a quaint, rude, wild, wilderness sort of life, both rude and rich. But when I am here I write more letters to friends than ever I do elsewhere. The mail comes only twice a week, and then is the event of the day. My old rabbi and I here set up our tent, he with German and Greek and Hebrew, devouring all sorts of black-letter books, and I spinning ideal webs out of bits that he lets fall here and there. I have long thought that I would write to you again when I got here, and so I do. I have sent North to have them send me the Harper's Weekly, in which your new story is appearing, and have promised myself leisurely to devour and absorb every word of it. While I think of it, I want to introduce you to a friend of mine, a most noble man, Mr. Owen, for some years our ambassador at Naples, now living a literary and scholar life in America. His father was Robert Dale Owen, the theorist and communist you may have heard of in England some years since. Years ago, in Naples, I visited Mr. Owen for the first time and found him directing his attention to the phenomena of Spiritism. He had stumbled upon some singular instances of it accidentally, and he had forthwith instituted a series of researches and experiments on the subject, some of which he showed me. It was the first time I had ever seriously thought of the matter, and he invited my sister and myself to see some of the phenomena as exhibited by a medium friend of theirs who resided in their family. The result at the time was sufficiently curious, but I was interested in his account of the manner in which he proceeded, keeping records of every experiment with its results in classified orders. As a result of his studies and observations, he has published 2 books. One, Footfalls on the Boundary of Another World, published in 1860, and latterly, The Debatable Land Between This World and the Next. I regard Mr. Owen as one of the few men who are capable of entering into an inquiry of this kind without an utter drowning of common sense, and his books are both of them worth a fair reading. To me, they present a great deal that is intensely curious and interesting, although I do not admit, of course, all his deductions, and think he often takes too much for granted. Still, with every abatement, there remains a residuum of fact, which I think both curious and useful. In a late letter to me, he says, quote, "There is no writer of the present day whom I more esteem than Mrs. Lewes, nor anyone whose opinion of my work I should more highly value." End quote. I believe he intends sending them to you, and I hope you will read them. Lest some of the narratives should strike you, as such narratives did me once, as being a perfect Arabian Nights entertainment, I want to say that I have accidentally been in the way of confirming some of the most remarkable by personal observation. In regard to all this class of subjects, I am of the opinion of Goethe that, quote, "it is just as absurd to deny the facts of spiritualism now as it was in the Middle Ages to ascribe them to the devil." End quote. I think Mr. Owen attributes too much value to his facts. I do not think the things contributed from the ultra-mundane sphere are particularly valuable, apart from the evidence they give of continued existence after death. I do not think there is yet any evidence to warrant the idea that they are a supplement or continuation of the revelations of Christianity, but I do regard them as an interesting and curious study in psychology, and every careful observer, like Mr. Owen, ought to be welcomed to bring in his facts. With this, I shall send you my observations on Mr. Owen's books from the Christian Union. I am perfectly aware of the frivolity and worthlessness of much of the revealings purported to come from spirits. In my view, the worth or worthlessness of them has nothing to do with the question of the fact. Do invisible spirits speak in any wise or foolish, is the question a priori. I do not know of any reason why there should not be as many foolish virgins in the future state as in this. As I am a believer in the Bible and Christianity, I don't need these things as confirmations, and they are not likely to be a religion to me. I regard them simply as I do the phenomenon of the aurora borealis, or Darwin's studies on natural selection, as curious studies into nature. Besides, I think some day we shall find a law by which all these facts will fall into their places. I hope now this subject does not bore you. It certainly is one that seems increasingly to insist on getting itself heard. It is going on and on, making converts who are many more than dare avow themselves, and for my part I wish it were all brought into the daylight of inquiry. Let me hear from you if ever you feel like it. I know too well the possibilities and impossibilities of a nature like yours to ask more, but it can do you no harm to know that I still think of you and love you as ever. Faithfully yours, H.B. Stowe. The Priory, 21 North Bank, Regent's Park, March 4th, 1872. Dear friend, I can understand very easily that the last 2 years have been full for you of other and more imperative work than the writing of letters not absolutely demanded, either by charity or business. The proof that you still think of me affectionately is very welcome now it has come, and more cheering because it enables me to think of you as enjoying your retreat in your orange orchard, your western Sorrento, the beloved rabbi still beside you. I am sure it must be a great blessing to you to bathe in that quietude, as it always is to us when we go out of reach of London influences and have the large space of country days to study, walk, and talk in. When I am more at liberty, I will certainly read Mr. Owen's books, if he is good enough to send them to me. I desire on all subjects to keep an open mind, but hitherto the various phenomena, reported or attested in connection with ideas of spirit intercourse and so on, have come before me here in the painful form of the lowest charlatanery. But apart from personal contact with people who get money by public exhibitions as mediums, or with semi-idiots such as those who make a court for a Mrs. Blank, or other feminine personages of that kind, I would not willingly place any barriers between my mind and any possible channel of truth affecting the human lot. The spirit in which you have written in the paper you kindly sent me is likely to touch others and rouse them at least to attention in a case where you have been deeply impressed. Yours with sincere affection, M. L. Lewes. Begun April 4th by Mrs. Stowe. Mandarin, Florida, May 11th, 1872. My dear friend, I was very glad to get your dear little note. Sorry to see by it that you are not in your full physical force. Owing to the awkwardness and misunderstanding of publishers, I am not reading Middlemarch as I expected to be, here in these orange shades. They don't send it, and I am too far out of the world to get it. I felt when I read your letters how glad I should be to have you here in our Florida cottage, in the wholly new, wild, woodland life. Though resembling Italy in climate, it is wholly different in the appearance of nature. The plants, the birds, the animals, all different. The green tidiness and culture of England here gives way to a wild and rugged savageness of beauty. Every tree bursts forth with flowers. Wild vines and creepers execute delirious gambols, and weave and interweave in interminable labyrinths. Yet here, the great sandy plains back of our house, there is a constant wondering sense of beauty in the wild, wonderful growths of nature. First of all, the pines, high as the stone pines of Italy, with long leaves, 18 inches long, through which there is a constant dreamy sound, as if of dashing waters. Then the live oaks and the water oaks, narrow-leaved evergreens which grow to enormous size and whose branches are draped with long festoons of grey moss. There is a great wild park of these trees back of us, which, with the dazzling varnished green of the new spring leaves and the swaying drapery of moss, looks like a sort of enchanted grotto. Underneath grow up hollies and ornamental flowering shrubs, and the yellow jasmine climbs into and over everything with fragrant golden bells and buds, so that sometimes the foliage of the tree is wholly hidden in its embrace. This wild, wonderful, bright and vivid growth that is all new, strange, and unknown by name to me has a charm for me. It is the place to forget the outside world and to live in one's self. And if you were here, we would go together and gather azaleas and white lilies and silver bells and blue iris. These flowers keep me painting in a sort of madness. I have just finished a picture of white lilies that grow in the moist land by the watercourses. I am longing to begin on blue iris. Artist, poet, as you are by nature, you ought to see all these things. And if you would come here, I would take you in heart and house, and you should have a little room in our cottage. The history of the cottage is this. I found a hut built close to a great live oak 25 feet in girth, and with overarching boughs 80 feet up in the air, spreading like a firmament, and all swaying with mossy festoons. We began to live here, and gradually we improved the hut by lath, plaster, and paper. Then we threw out a wide veranda all around, for in these regions the veranda is the living room of the house. Ours had to be built round the trunk of a tree, so that our cottage has a peculiar and original air, and seems as if it were half tree, or a something that has grown out of the tree. We added on parts, and have thrown out gables and chambers, as a tree throws out new branches, till our cottage is like nobody else's, and yet we settle into it with real enjoyment. There are all sorts of queer little rooms in it, and we are accommodating at this present a family of 17 souls. In front, the beautiful Grand St. John stretches 5 miles from shore to shore, and we watch the steamboats plying back and forth to the great world we are out of. On all sides, large orange trees, with their dense shade and ever-vivid green, shut out the sun so that we can sit and walk and live in the open air. Our winter here is only cool, bracing outdoor weather, without snow. No month without flowers blooming in the open air, and lettuce and peas in the garden. The summer range is about 90 degrees, but the sea breezes keep the air delightfully fresh. Generally we go north, however, for 3 months of summer. Well, I do not mean to run on about Florida, but the subject runs away with me, and I want you to visit us in spirit, if not personally. My poor rabbi, he sends you some Arabic, which I fear you cannot read. On diablerie he is up to his ears in knowledge, having read all things in all tongues, from the Talmud down. Ever lovingly yours, H.B. Stowe. Boston, September 26, 1872. My dear friend, I think when you see my name again so soon, you will think it rains, hails, and snows notes from this quarter. Just now, however, I am in this lovely little nest in Boston, where dear Mrs. Fields, like a dove, sits brooding on the charmed wave. We are both wishing we had you here with us, and she has not received any answer from you as yet in reply to the invitation you spoke of in your last letter to me. It seems as if you must have written and the letter somehow gone astray, because I know, of course, you would write. Yesterday, reading Middlemarch, we were both out of our senses with mingled pity and indignation at that dreadful stick of a Casaubon, and to think of poor Dorothea dashing like a warm, sunny wave against so cold and repulsive a rock. He is a little too dreadful for anything. There does not seem to be a drop of warm blood in him, and so, as it is his misfortune and not his fault to be cold-blooded, one must not get angry with him. It is the scene in the garden, after the interview with the doctor, that rests on our mind at present. There was such a man as he over in Boston, high in literary circles, but I fancy his wife wasn't like Dorothea, and a vastly proper time they had of it, treating each other with mutual reverence, like two Chinese mandarins. My love, what I miss in this story is just what we would have if you would come to our tumbled-down, jolly, improper but joyous country, namely, Jollitude. You write and live on so high a plane. It is all self-abnegation. We want to get you over here and into this house, where with closed doors we sometimes make the rafters ring with fun and say anything and everything, no matter what, and won't be any properer than we's a mind to be. I am wishing every day you could see our America, travel as I have been doing from one bright, thriving, pretty, flowery town to another, and see so much wealth, ease, progress, culture, and all sorts of nice things. This dovecot where I am now is the sweetest little nest imaginable, fronting on a city street, with back windows opening on a sea view, with still, quiet rooms filled with books, pictures, and all sorts of things, such as you and Mr. Lewes would enjoy. Don't be afraid of the ocean now. I've crossed it 6 times, and assure you it is an overrated item. Froude is coming here, why not you? Besides, we have the Fountain of Eternal Youth here, that is, in Florida, where I live, and if you should come you would both of you take a new lease of life, and what glorious poems and philosophies and what not we should have. My rabbi writes in the 7th heaven an account of your note to him. To think of his setting off on his own account when I was away. Come now, since your answer to dear Miss Fields is yet to come, let it be a glad yes, and we will clasp you to our heart of hearts. Your ever-loving H.B.S. End of Chapter 20, Part 1. Read for you by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Chapter 20, Part 2 of the Life of Harriet Beecher Stowe, compiled from her letters and journals by her son Charles Edward Stowe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 20, George Eliot, Part 2. During the summer of 1874, while Mrs. Stowe's brother, the Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, was the victim of a most revolting, malicious, and groundless attack on his purity, Mrs. Lewes wrote the following words of sympathy. My dear friend, the other day I had a letter from Mrs. Fields, written to let me know something of you under that heavy trouble, of which such information as I have had has been quite untrustworthy, leaving me in entire incredulity in regard to it, except on this point, that you and yours must be suffering deeply. Naturally, I thought most of you in the matter, the public aspects being indeterminate, and many times before our friend's letter came, I had said to Mr. Lewes, what must Mrs. Stowe be feeling? I remember Mrs. Fields once told me of the wonderful courage and cheerfulness which belonged to you, enabling you to bear up under exceptional trials, and I imagined you helping the sufferers with tenderness and counsel, but yet, nevertheless, I felt that there must be a bruising weight on your heart. Dear honored friend, you who are so ready to give warm fellowship, is it any comfort to you to be told that those afar off are caring for you in spirit, and will be happier for all good issues that may bring you rest? I cannot, dare not, write more in my ignorance, lest I should be using unreasonable words. But I trust in your not despising this scrap of paper, which tells you, perhaps rather for my relief than yours, that I am always in grateful sweet remembrance of your goodness to me and your energetic labors for all." End quote. It was 2 years or more before Mrs. Stowe replied to these words of sympathy. Orange Blossom Time, Mandarin, March 18th, 1876. My dear friend, I always think of you when the orange trees are in blossom. Just now they are fuller than ever, and so many bees are filling the branches that the air is full of a sort of still murmur. And now I am beginning to hear from you every month in Harper's. It is as good as a letter. Daniel Deronda has succeeded in awakening in my somewhat worn-out mind an interest. So many stories are tramping over one's mind in every modern magazine nowadays that one is macadamized, so to speak. It takes something unusual to make a sensation. This does excite and interest me as I wait for each number with eagerness. I wish I could endow you with our long winter weather, not winter except such as you find in Sicily. We live here from November to June, and my husband sits out on the veranda and reads all day. We emigrate in solid family. My 2 dear daughters, husband, self, and servants come together to spend the winter here, and so together to our northern home in summer. My twin daughters relieve me from all domestic care. They are lively, vivacious, with a real genius for practical life. We have around us a little settlement of neighbors who, like ourselves, have a winter home here and live an easy, undressed, picnic kind of life, far from the world and its cares. Mr. Stowe has been busy on 8 volumes of Gorez on the mysticism of the Middle Ages. This Gorez was professor of philosophy at Munich, and he reviews the whole ground of the shadowland between the natural and the supernatural, ecstasy, trance, prophecy, miracles, spiritualism, and stigmata, etc. He was a devout Roman Catholic, and the so-called facts that he reasons on seem to me quite amazing. And yet the possibilities that lie between inert matter and man's living, all-powerful, immortal soul may make almost anything credible. The soul at times can do anything with matter. I have been busying myself with St. Beuve's 7 volumes on the Port Royal development. I like him, St. Beuve. His capacity of seeing, doing justice to all kinds of natures and sentiments, is wonderful. I am sorry he is no longer our side the veil. There is a red bird, Cardinal Grosbeak, singing in the orange trees fronting my window, so sweetly and insistently as to almost stop my writing. I hope, dear friend, you are well, better than when you wrote last. It was very sweet and kind of you to write what you did last. I suppose it is so long ago you may have forgotten, but it was a word of tenderness and sympathy about my brother's trial. It was womanly, tender, and sweet, such as at heart you are. After all, my love of you is greater than my admiration, for I think it more and better to be really a woman worth loving than to have read Greek and German and written books. And in this last book I read, I feel more with you in some little fine points. They stare at me as making an amusing exhibition. For, my dear, I feel myself at last as one who has been playing and picnicking on the shores of life, and waked from a dream late in the afternoon to find that everybody almost has gone over to the beyond, and the rest are sorting their things and packing their trunks, and waiting for the boat to come and take them. It seems now but a little time since my brother Henry and I were 2 young people together. He was my 2 years junior, and nearest companion out of 7 brothers and 3 sisters. I taught him drawing, and heard his Latin lessons, for you know a girl becomes mature and womanly long before a boy. I saw him through college, and helped him through the difficult love affair that gave him his wife, and then he and my husband had a real German enthusiastic love for each other, which ended in making me a wife. Ah, in those days we never dreamed that he or I or any of us would be known in the world. All he seemed then was a boy full of fun, full of love, full of enthusiasm for protecting abused and righting wronged people, which made him in those early days write editorials and wear arms and swear himself a special policeman to protect the poor Negroes in Cincinnati, where we then lived, where then were mobs instigated by the slaveholders of Kentucky. Then he married and lived a missionary life in the New West, all with a joyousness, an enthusiasm, a chivalry which made life bright and vigorous to us both. Then in time he was called to Brooklyn, just as the crisis of the great anti-slavery battle came on, and the fugitive slave law was passed. I was then in Maine, and I well remember one snowy night his writing till midnight to see me, and then our talking till near morning what we could do to make headway against the horrid cruelties that were being practiced against the defenseless blacks. My husband was then away lecturing, and my heart was burning itself out in indignation and anguish. Henry told me then that he meant to fight that battle in New York, that he would have a church that would stand by him to resist the tyrannic dictation of Southern slaveholders. I said, I too have begun to do something. I have begun a story, trying to set forth the sufferings and wrongs of the slaves. That's right, Hattie, said he. Finish it, and I will scatter it thick as leaves of Valombrosa. And so came Uncle Tom, and Plymouth Church became a stronghold where the slave always found refuge and a strong helper. One morning my brother found sitting on his doorstep poor old Paul Edmondson, weeping. His 2 daughters of 16 and 18 had passed into the slave warehouse of Bruin and Hill and were to be sold. My brother took the man by the hand to a public meeting, told his story for him, and in an hour raised the $2,000 to redeem his children. Over and over again afterwards, slaves were redeemed at Plymouth Church, and Henry and Plymouth Church became words of hatred and fear through half the Union. From that time until we talked together about the fugitive slave law, there was not a pause or stop in the battle till we had been through the war and slavery had been wiped out in blood. Through all he has been pouring himself out, wrestling, burning, laboring everywhere, making stump speeches when elections turned on the slave question, and ever maintaining that the cause of Christ was the cause of the slave. And when all was over, it was he and Lord Garrison who were sent by government once more to raise our national flag on Fort Sumter. You must see that a man does not so energize without making many enemies. Half of our Union has been defeated, a property of millions annihilated by emancipation, a proud and powerful slave aristocracy reduced to beggary, and there are those who never saw our faces that to this hour hate him and me. Then he has been a progressive in theology. He has been a student of Huxley and Spencer and Darwin, enough to alarm the old school, and yet remained so ardent a supernaturalist as equally to repel the radical destructionists in religion. He and I are Christ worshippers, adoring him as the image of the invisible God and all that comes from believing this. Then he has been a reformer, an advocate of universal suffrage and women's rights, yet not radical enough to please that reform party who stand where the socialists of France do, and are for tearing up all creation generally. Lastly, he has had the misfortune of a popularity which is perfectly phenomenal. I cannot give you any idea of the love, worship, idolatry with which he has been overwhelmed. He has something magnetic about him that makes everybody crave his society, that makes men follow and worship him. I remember being at his house one evening in the time of early flowers, and in that one evening came a box of flowers from Maine, another from New Jersey, another from Connecticut, all from people with whom he had no personal acquaintance, who had read something of his and wanted to send him some token. I said, "One would think you were a prima donna. What does make people go on so about you?" My brother is hopelessly generous and confiding. His inability to believe evil is something incredible, and so has come all this suffering. You said you hoped I should be at rest when the first investigating committee and Plymouth Church cleared my brother almost by acclamation. Not so. The enemy have so committed themselves that either they or he must die, and there has followed 2 years of the most dreadful struggle. First, a legal trial of 6 months, the expenses of which on his side were $118,000, and in which he and his brave wife sat side by side in the courtroom and heard all that these plotters, who had been weaving their webs for 3 years, could bring. The foreman of the jury was offered a bribe of $10,000 to decide against my brother. He sent the letter containing the proposition to the judge. But with all their plotting, 3/4 of the jury decided against them, and their case was lost. This was accepted as a triumph by my brother's friends. A large number of the most influential clergy of all denominations so expressed themselves in a public letter, and it was hoped the thing was so far over that it might be lived down and overgrown with better things. But the enemy, intriguing secretly with all those parties in the community who wished to put down a public and too successful man, have been struggling to bring the thing up again for an ecclesiastical trial. The cry has been raised in various religious papers that Plymouth Church was in complicity with crime, that they were so captivated with eloquence and genius that they refused to make competent investigation. The 6 months' legal investigation was insufficient. A new trial was needed. Plymouth Church immediately called a council of ministers and laymen, in number representing 37,000 Congregational Christians, to whom Plymouth Church surrendered her records, her conduct, all the facts of the case, and this great council unanimously supported the Church and ratified her decision, recognizing the fact that in all the investigations hitherto nothing had been proved against my brother. They, at his request and that of Plymouth Church, appointed a committee of 5 to whom within 60 days and 1 should bring any facts that they could prove, or else forever after hold their peace. It is thought now by my brother's friends that this thing must finally reach a close. But you see why I have not written. This has drawn on my life, my heart's blood. He is myself. I know you are the kind of woman to understand me when I say that I felt a blow at him more than at myself. I, who know his purity, honor, delicacy, know that he has been from childhood of an ideal purity, who reverenced his conscience as his king, whose glory was redressing human wrong, who spake no slander, no, nor listened to it. Never have I known a nature of such strength and such almost childlike innocence. He is of a nature so sweet and perfect that though I have seen him thunderously indignant at moments, I never saw him fretful or irritable. A man who continuously, in every little act of life, is thinking of others. A man that all the children on the street run after, and that every sorrowful, weak, or distressed person looks to as a natural helper. In all this long history there has been no circumstance of his relation to any woman that has not been worthy of himself, pure, delicate, and proper, and I know all sides of it, and certainly should not say this if there was even a misgiving. Thank God there is none, and I can read my New Testament and feel that by all the Beatitudes my brother is blessed. His calmness, serenity, and cheerfulness through all this time have uplifted us all. Where he was, there was no anxiety, no sorrow. My brother's power to console is something peculiar and wonderful. I have seen him at deathbeds and funerals, where it would seem as if hope herself must be dumb, bring down the very peace of heaven, and change despair to trust. He has not had less power in his own adversity. You cannot conceive how he is beloved by those even who never saw him. Old, paralytic, distressed, neglected people, poor seamstresses, black people, who have felt these arrows shot against their benefactor as against themselves, and most touching have been their letters of sympathy. From the first he has met this in the spirit of Francis de Sales, who met a similar plot. By silence, prayer, and work, and when urged to defend himself, said God would do it in his time. God was the best judge how much reputation he needed to serve him with. In your portrait of Deronda, you speak of him as one of those rare natures in whom a private wrong bred no bitterness. Quote, the sense of injury breeds not the will to inflict injuries, but a hatred of all injury. End quote. And I must say, through all this conflict, my brother has always been in the spirit of him who touched and healed the ear of Malchus when he himself was attacked. His friends and lawyers have sometimes been aroused and sometimes indignant with his habitual caring for others, and his habit of vindicating and extending even to his enemies every scrap and shred of justice that might belong to them. From first to last of this trial, he has never for a day intermitted his regular work. Preaching to crowded houses, preaching even in his short vacations at watering places, carrying on his missions which have regenerated 2 once wretched districts of the city, editing a paper, and in short, giving himself up to work. He cautioned his church not to become absorbed in him and his trials, to prove their devotion by more faithful church work and a wider charity, and never have the Plymouth missions among the poor been so energetic and effective. He said recently, the worst that can befall a man is to stop thinking of God and begin thinking of himself. If trials make us self-absorbed, they hurt us. Well, dear, pardon me for this outpour. I loved you, I love you, and therefore wanted you to know just what I felt. Now, dear, this is over. Don't think you must reply to it or me. I know how much you have to do. Yes, I know all about an aching head and an overtaxed brain. This last work of yours is to be your best, I think, and I hope it will bring you enough to buy an orange grove in Sicily or somewhere else, and so have lovely weather such as we have here. Your ancient admirer, my husband, who usually goes to bed at 8 o'clock, was convicted by me of sitting up after 11 over the last installment of Daniel Deronda, and he is full of it. We think well of Gwendolen, and that she isn't much more than young ladies in general so far. Next year, if I can possibly do it, I will send you some of our oranges. I perfectly long to have you enjoy them. Your ever-loving H.B. Stowe. P.S. I am afraid I shall write you again when I am reading your writings. They are so provokingly suggestive of things one wants to say. H.B.S. In her reply to this letter, Mrs. Lewes says incidentally, quote, Please offer my reverential love to the professor and tell him I am ruthlessly proud of having kept him out of his bed. I hope that both you and he will continue to be interested in my spiritual children. End quote. After Mr. Lewes' death, Mrs. Lewes writes to Mrs. Stowe. The Priory, 21 North Bank, April 10, 1879. My dear friend, I have been long without sending you any sign unless you have received a message from me through Mrs. Fields, but my heart has been going out to you and your husband continuously as among the chief of the many kind beings who have given me their tender fellow-feeling in my last earthly sorrow. When your first letter came with the beautiful gift of your book, footnote, Uncle Tom's Cabin, new edition with introduction, end footnote, I was unable to read any letters and did not for a long time see what you had sent me, but when I did know and had read your words of thankfulness at the great good you have seen wrought by your help, I felt glad for your sake first, and then for the sake of the great nation to which you belong. The hopes of the world are taking refuge westward under the calamitous conditions, moral and physical, in which we of the elder world are getting involved. Thank you for telling me that you have the comfort of seeing your son in a path that satisfies your best wishes for him. I like to think of your having family joys. One of the prettiest photographs of a child that I possess is one of your sending to me. Please offer my reverential, affectionate regards to your husband, and believe me, my dear friend, yours always gratefully, M.L. Lewes. As much as has been said with regard to spiritualism in these pages, the subject has by no means the prominence that it really possessed in the studies and conversations of both Professor and Mrs. Stowe. Professor Stowe's very remarkable psychological development and the exceptional experiences of his early life were sources of conversation of unfailing interest and study to both. Professor Stowe had made an elaborate and valuable collection of the literature on the subject, and was, as Mrs. Stowe writes, over head and ears in diablerie. It is only just to give Mrs. Stowe's views on this perplexing theme more at length, and as the mature reflection of many years has caused them to take form. In reference to professional mediums and spirits that peep, rap, and mutter, she writes, quote, "Each friend takes away a portion of ourselves. There was some part of our being related to him as no other, and we had things to say to him which no other would understand and appreciate. A portion of our thoughts has become useless and burdensome, and again, with involuntary yearning, we turn to the stone at the door of the sepulchre. We lean against the cold, silent marble, but there is no answer, no voice, neither any that regardeth. There are those who would have us think that in our day this doom is reversed, that there are those who have the power to restore to us the communion with our lost ones. How many a heart, wrung and tortured with the anguish of this fearful silence, has throbbed with strange, vague hopes at the suggestion! When we hear sometimes of persons of the strongest and clearest minds becoming credulous votaries of certain spiritualist circles, let us not wonder. If we inquire, we shall almost always find that the belief has followed some stroke of death. It is only an indication of the desperation of that heart hunger which in part it appeases. Ah, were it true! Were it indeed so that the wall between the spiritual and material is growing thin, and a new dispensation germinating, in which communion with the departed blessed shall be among the privileges and possibilities of this our mortal state! Ah, were it so that when we go forth weeping in the grey dawn, bearing spices and odours which we long to pour forth for the beloved dead, we should indeed find the stone rolled away and an angel sitting on it! But no such angel have we seen, no such sublime, unquestionable, glorious manifestation. And when we look at what is offered to us, ah, who that had a friend in heaven could wish them to return in such wise as this? The very instinct of a sacred sorrow seems to forbid that our beautiful, our glorified ones should stoop lower than even to the medium of their cast-off bodies, to juggle and rap and squeak, and perform mountebank tricks with tables and chairs, to recite over in weary sameness harmless truisms, which we were wise enough to say for ourselves, to trifle and banter and jest, or to lead us through endless moonshiny mazes. Sadly and soberly we say that if this be communion with the dead, we had rather be without it. We want something a little in advance of our present life, and not below it. We have read with some attention weary pages of spiritual communication purporting to come from Bacon, Swedenborg, and others, and long accounts from divers spirits of things seen in the spirit land, and we can conceive of no more appalling prospect than to have them true. If the future life is so weary, stale, flat, and unprofitable as we might infer from these readings, one would have reason to deplore an immortality from which no suicide could give an outlet. To be condemned to such eternal prosing would be worse than annihilation. Is there, then, no satisfaction from this craving of the soul? There is one who says, I am he that liveth and was dead, and behold, I am alive for evermore, and I have the keys of hell and of death. And this same being said once before, He that loveth me shall be loved of my Father, and I will love him and will manifest myself unto him. This is a promise direct and personal, not confined to the first apostles, but stated in the most general way, as attainable by anyone who loves and does the will of Jesus. It seems given to us as some comfort for the unavoidable, heartbreaking separations of death that there should be, in that dread unknown, one all-powerful friend with whom it is possible to commune, and from whose spirit there may come a response to us. Our elder brother, the partaker of our nature, is not only in the spirit land, but is all-powerful there. It is he that shutteth, and no man openeth, and openeth, and no man shutteth. He whom we have seen in the flesh, weeping over the grave of Lazarus, is he who hath the keys of hell and of death. If we cannot commune with our friends, we can at least commune with him to whom they are present, who is intimately with them as with us. He is the true bond of union between the spirit world and our souls, and one blessed hour of prayer when we draw near to him and feel the breadth and length and depth and height of that love of his that passeth knowledge is better than all those incoherent, vain, dreamy glimpses with which longing hearts are cheated. They who have disbelieved all spiritual truth, who have been Sadduceic doubters of either angel or spirit, may find in modern spiritualism a great advance. But can one who has ever really had communion with Christ, who has said with John, "Truly our fellowship is with the Father and the Son," can such an one be satisfied with what is found in the modern circle? For Christians who have strayed into these enclosures, we cannot but recommend the homely but apt quotation of old John Newton. "What think ye of Christ is the test, to try both your word and your scheme." In all these so-called revelations, have there come any echoes of the new song which no man save the redeemed from earth could learn? Any unfoldings of that love that passeth knowledge? Anything, in short, such as spirits might utter, to whom was unveiled that which eye hath not seen, nor ear heard, neither hath entered the heart of man to conceive? We must confess that all those spirits that yet have spoken appear to be living in quite another sphere from John or Paul. Let us, then, who long for communion with spirits, seek nearness to him who has promised to speak and commune, leaving forever this word to his church: "I will not leave you comfortless. I will come to you." End of chapter 20. Read for you by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Chapter 21, Part 1 of the Life of Harriet Beecher Stowe, compiled from her letters and journals by her son Charles Edward Stowe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 21, Closing Scenes, 1870 through 1889. Part 1. Literary labors, complete list of published books, first reading tour, peeps behind the curtain, some New England cities, a letter from Maine, pleasant and unpleasant readings, second tour, a Western journey, visit to old scenes, celebration of 70th birthday, congratulatory poems from Mr. Whittier and Dr. Holmes, last words. Besides the annual journeys to and from Florida and her many interests in the South, Mrs. Stowe's time between 1870 and 1880 was largely occupied by literary and kindred labors. In the autumn of 1871, we find her writing to her daughters the following regarding her work. Quote, "I have at last finished all my part in the third book of mine that is to come out this year, to wit, Oldtown Fireside Stories, and you can have no idea what a perfect luxury of rest it is to be free from all literary engagements of all kinds, sorts, or descriptions. I feel like a poor woman I once read about, who was always tired because she lived in a house where help wasn't hired, and of whom it is related that in her dying moments she folded her hands with her latest endeavor, saying nothing, dear nothing, sweet nothing forever. I am in about her state of mind. I luxuriate in laziness. I do not want to do anything or go anywhere. I only want to sink down in lazy enjoyment of living." End quote. She was certainly well entitled to a rest, for never had there been a more laborious literary life. In addition to the 23 books already written, she had prepared for various magazines and journals an incredible number of short stories, letters of travel, essays, and other articles. Yet with all she had accomplished, and tired as she was, she still had 7 books to write, besides many more short stories, before her work should be done. As her literary life did not really begin until 1852, the bulk of her work has been accomplished within 26 years, as will be seen from the following list of her books, arranged in the chronological order of their publication. 1833, An Elementary Geography. 1843, The Mayflower. 1852, Uncle Tom's Cabin. 1853, Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin. 1854, Sunny Memories. 1856, Dread. 1858, Our Charlie. 1859, Minister's Wooing. 1862, Pearl of Oars Island. 1863, Agnes of Sorrento. 1864, House and Home Papers. 1865, Little Foxes. 1866, Nina Gordon, formerly Dread. 1867, Religious Poems. 1867, Queer Little People. 1868, The Chimney Corner. 1868, Men of Our Times. 1869, Oldtown Folks. 1870, Lady Byron Vindicated. 1871, The History of the Byron Controversy, London. 1870, Little Pussy Willow. 1871, Pink and White Tyranny. 1871, Oldtown Fireside Stories. 1872, My Wife and I. 1873, Palmetto Leaves. 1873, Library of Famous Fiction. 1875, We and Our Neighbors. 1876, Betty's Bright Idea. 1877, Footsteps of the Master. 1878, Bible Heroines. 1878, Pugganuk People. 1881, A Dog's Mission. In 1872, a new and remunerative field of labor was opened to Mrs. Stowe, and though it entailed a vast amount of weariness and hard work, she entered it with her customary energy and enthusiasm. It presented itself in the shape of an offer from the American Literary Lecture Bureau of Boston to deliver a course of 40 readings from her own works in the principal cities of the New England states. The offer was a liberal one, and Mrs. Stowe accepted it on condition that the reading tour should be ended in time to allow her to go to her Florida home in December. This being acceded to, she set forth and gave her first reading in Bridgeport, Connecticut, on the evening of September 19, 1872. The following extracts from letters written to her husband while on this reading tour throw some interesting gleams of light on the scenes behind the curtain of the lecturer's platform. From Boston, October 3rd, she writes, quote, Have had a most successful but fatiguing week. Read in Cambridgeport tonight and Newburyport tomorrow night. End quote. 2 weeks later, upon receipt of a letter from her husband in which he fears he has not long to live, she writes from Westfield, Massachusetts, quote, I have never had a greater trial than being forced to stay away from you now. I would not, but that my engagements have involved others in very heavy expense, and should I fail to fulfill them, it would be doing a wrong. God has given me strength as I needed it, and I never read more to my own satisfaction than last night. Now, my dear husband, please do want and try to remain with us yet a while longer, and let us have a little quiet evening together before either of us crosses the river. My heart cries out for a home with you, our home together in Florida. Oh, may we see it again! Your ever-loving wife. End quote. From Fitchfield, Massachusetts, under date of October 29th, she writes, quote, In the cars near Palmer, who should I discover but Mr. and Mrs. J.T. Fields, returning from a western trip, as gay as a troubadour. I took an empty seat next to them, and we had a jolly ride to Boston. I drove to Mr. Williams' house, where I met the Chelsea agent, who informed me that there was no hotel in Chelsea, but that they were expecting to send over for me. so I turned at once toward 148 Charles Street, where I tumbled in on the Fields before they had got their things off. We had a good laugh, and I received a hearty welcome. I was quickly installed in my room, where, after a nice dinner, I curled up for my afternoon nap. At 7:30 the carriage came for me, and I was informed that I should not have a hard reading, as they had engaged singers to take part. So, when I got into the carriage, who should I find, beshawled and beflowered, and betoggled in blue satin and white lace, but our old dear friend of Andover concert memory, now become Madame Thingumbob of European celebrity. She had studied in Italy, come out in Milan, sung there in opera for a whole winter, and also in Paris and London. Well, she sings very sweetly and looks very nice and pretty. Then we had a little rosebud of a Chelsea girl who sang, and a pianist. I read Minister's Housekeeper and Topsy, and the audience was very jolly and appreciative. Then we all jogged home." End quote. The next letter finds Mrs. Stowe in Maine, and writing in the cars between Bangor and Portland. She says, "My dear husband, well, Portland and Bangor are over, and the latter, which I had dreaded as lonesome and far off, turned out the pleasantest of any place I have visited yet. I stayed at the Fays. He was one of the Andover students, you remember, and found a warm, cozy, social home. In the evening I met an appreciative audience and had a delightful reading. I read Captain Kitteridge, apparently to the great satisfaction of the people, who laughed heartily at his sea stories, and the Minister's Housekeeper with the usual success, also Eva and Topsy. One woman, totally deaf, came to me afterwards and said, 'Bless you, I come just to see you. I'd rather see you than the Queen.' Another introduced her little girl named Harriet Beecher Stowe, and another, older, named Eva. She said they had traveled 50 miles to hear me read. An incident like that appeals to one's heart, does it not? The people of Bangor were greatly embarrassed by the horse disease, but the mayor and his wife walked over from their house a long distance off to bring me flowers, and at the reading he introduced me. I had an excellent audience, notwithstanding that it rained tremendously and everybody had to walk because there were no horses. The professors called on me, also Newman Smith, now a settled minister here. Everybody is so anxious about you, and Mr. Fay made me promise that you and I should come and spend a week with them next summer. Mr. Howard in Portland called upon me to inquire for you, and everybody was so delighted to hear that you were getting better. It stormed all the time I was in Portland and Bangor, so I saw nothing of them. Now I am in a palace car riding along the Kennebec and recalling the incidents of my trip. I certainly had very satisfactory houses, and these pleasant little visits and meetings with old acquaintances would be well worth having, even though I had made nothing in a pecuniary sense. On the whole, it is as easy a way of making money as I have ever tried, though no way of making money is perfectly easy. There must be some disagreeables. The lonesomeness of being at a hotel in dull weather is one, and in Portland it seems there is nobody now to invite us to their homes. Our old friends there are among the past. They have gone over the river. I send you a bit of poetry that pleases me. The love of the old for each other has its poetry. It is something sacred and full of riches. I long to be with you and to have some more of our good long talks. The scenery along this river is very fine. The oaks still keep their leaves, though the other trees are bare, but oaks and pines make a pleasant contrast. We shall stop 20 minutes at Brunswick, so I shall get a glimpse of the old place. Now we are passing through Hallowell, and the Kennebec changes sides. What a beautiful river! It is now full of logs and rafts. Well, I must bring this to a close. Goodbye, dear, with unchanging love. Ever your wife. From South Framingham, Massachusetts, she writes on November the 7th. Well, my dear, here I am in E.'s pretty little house. He has a pretty wife, a pretty sister, a pretty baby, 2 nice little boys, and a lovely white cat. The last is a perfect beauty, a Persian from a stock brought over by Dr. Parker, as white as snow, with the softest fur, a perfect bunch of loving kindness, all purr and felicity. I had a good audience last evening and enjoyed it. My audiences, considering the horse disease and the rains, are amazing, and how they do laugh. We get into regular gales. E has the real country minister turnout, horse and buggy, and such a nice horse, too. The baby is a beauty, and giggles and goos, and shouts inquiries with the rising inflection in the most inspiring manner. November 13th, Wakefield. I read in Haverhill last night. It was, as usual, stormy. I had a good audience, but not springy and inspirited like that at Waltham. Some audiences seemed to put spring into one, and some to take it out. This one seemed good, but heavy. I had to lift them, while in Framingham and Waltham they lifted me. The Lord bless and keep you. It grieves me to think you are dull and I not with you. By and by we will be together and stay together. Goodbye, dear. Your ever-loving wife, H.B.S. November 24th, she writes. I had a very pleasant reading in Peabody. While there, visited the library and saw the picture of the Queen that she had painted expressly for George Peabody. It was about 6 inches square, enameled on gold, and set in a massive frame of solid gold and velvet. The effect is like painting on ivory. At night the picture rolls back into a safe, and great doors, closed with a combination lock, defend it. It reminded me of some of the foreign wonders we have seen. Well, my course is almost done, and if I get through without any sickness, cold, or accident, how wonderful it will seem. I have never felt the near, kind presence of our Heavenly Father so much as in this, quote, He giveth strength to the faint, and to them of no might he increaseth strength. End quote. I have found this true all my life. From Newport she writes on November 26th, quote, It was a hard, tiring, disagreeable piece of business to read in New London. Had to wait 3 mortal hours in Palmer, then a slow, weary train that did not reach New London until after dark. There was then no time to rest, and I was so tired that it did seem as though I could not dress. I really trembled with fatigue. The hall was long and dimly lighted, and the people were not seated compactly, but around in patches. The light was dim, except for a great flaring gas jet arranged right under my eyes on my reading desk, and I did not see a creature whom I knew. I was only too glad when it was over and I was back again at my hotel. There I found that I must be up at 5 o'clock to catch the Newport train. I started for this place in the dusk of a dreary, foggy morning. Traveled first on a ferry, then in cars, and then in a little cold steamboat. Found no one to meet me in spite of all my writing, and so took a carriage and came to the hotel. The landlord was very polite to me, said he knew me by my trunk, had been to our place in Mandarin, etc. All I wanted was a warm room, a good bed, and an unlimited time to sleep. Now I have had a 3-hour nap, and here I am, sitting by myself in the great lonely hotel parlor. Well, dear old man, I think lots of you, and only want to end all this in a quiet home where we can sing John Anderson, My Joe, together. I check off place after place as the captive the days of his imprisonment. Only 2 more after tonight. Ever your loving wife. End quote. Mrs. Stowe made one more reading tour the following year, and this time it was in the West. On October 28, 1873, she writes from Zanesville, Ohio, to her son at Harvard, quote, You have been very good to write as often as you have, and your letters, meeting me at different points, have been most cheering. I have been tired almost to the last degree. Read 2 successive evenings in Chicago, and traveled the following day for 13 hours, a distance of about 300 miles, to Cincinnati. We were compelled to go in the most uncomfortable cars I ever saw, crowded to overflowing, a fiend of a stove at each end burning up all the air, and without a chance to even lay my head down. This is the grand route between Chicago and Cincinnati, and we were on it from 8 in the morning until nearly 10 at night. Arrived in Cincinnati, we found that George Beecher had not received our telegram, was not expecting us, had no rooms engaged for us, and that we could not get rooms at his boarding place. After finding all this out, we had to go to the hotel, where, about 11 o'clock, I crept into bed with every nerve aching from fatigue. The next day was dark and rainy, and I lay in bed most of it, but when I got up to go and read, I felt only half rested, and was still so tired that it seemed as though I could not get through. Those who planned my engagements failed to take into account the fearful distances and wretched trains out here. On none of these great western routes is there a drawing-room car. Mr. Saunders tried in every way to get them to put one in for us, but in vain. They are all reserved for the night trains, so that there is no choice except to travel by night in sleeping cars or take such trains as I have described in the daytime. I had a most sympathetic audience in Cincinnati. They all seemed delighted and begged me to come again. The next day George took us for a drive out to Walnut Hills, where we saw the seminary buildings, the house where your sisters were born, and the house in which we afterwards lived. In the afternoon we had to leave and hurry away to a reading in Dayton. The next evening another in Columbus, where we spent Sunday with an old friend. By this time I am somewhat rested from the strain of that awful journey, but I shall never again undertake such another. It was one of those things that have to be done once to learn not to do it again. My only reading between Columbus and Pittsburgh is to be here in Zanesville, a town as black as Acheron, and where one might expect to see the river Styx. Later, I had a nice audience and a pleasant reading here, and today we go on to Pittsburgh, where I read tomorrow night. I met the other day at Dayton a woman who now has grandchildren, but who, when I first came west, was a gay, rattling girl. She was one of the first converts of Brother George's seemingly obscure ministry in the new little town of Chillicothe. Now she has one son who is a judge of the Supreme Court and another in business. Both she and they are not only Christians, but Christians of the primitive sort, whose religion is their all, who triumph and glory in tribulation, knowing that it worketh patience. She told me, with a bright, sweet calm, of her husband killed in battle the first year of the war, of her only daughter and 2 grandchildren dying in the faith, and of her own happy waiting on God's will, with bright hopes of a joyful reunion. Her sons are leading members of the Presbyterian Church, and most active in stirring up others to make their profession a reality, not an empty name. When I thought that all this came from the conversion of one giddy girl, when George seemed to be doing so little, I said, "Who can measure the work of a faithful minister?" It is such living witnesses that maintain Christianity on earth. Goodbye. We shall soon be home now and preparing for Florida. Always your own loving mother, H.B.S. Mrs. Stowe never undertook another reading tour, nor after this one did she ever read again for money, though she frequently contributed her talent in this direction to the cause of charity. This ends Chapter 21, Part 1, read for you by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Chapter 21, Part 2 of the Life of Harriet Beecher Stowe, compiled from her letters and journals by her son Charles Edward Stowe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 21, Closing Scenes, 1870 through 1889, Part 2. The most noteworthy event of her later years was the celebration of the 70th anniversary of her birthday. That it might be fittingly observed, her publishers, Messrs. Houghton, Mifflin and Company of Boston, arranged a reception for her in form of a garden party to which they invited the literati of America. It was held on June 14, 1882, at the Old Elms, the home of ex-Governor Claflin of Massachusetts, in Newtonville, one of Boston's most beautiful suburbs. Here the assembly gathered to do honor to Mrs. Stowe that lovely June afternoon, comprised of 200 of the most distinguished and best known among the literary men and women of the day. From 3 until 5 o'clock was spent socially. As the guests arrived, they were presented to Mrs. Stowe by Mr. H. O. Houghton, and then they gathered in groups in the parlors, on the verandas, on the lawn, and in the refreshment room. At 5 o'clock they assembled in a large tent on the lawn, when Mr. Houghton, as host, addressed to his guest and her friends a few words of congratulation and welcome. He closed his remarks by saying, "And now, honored madam, as when to them who sail beyond the Cape of Hope, and now are past Mozambique, off at sea northeast winds blow Sabaean odors from the spicy shore of Araby the Blessed, so the benedictions of the lowly and the blessings of all conditions of men are brought to you today on the wings of the wind from every quarter of the globe. But there will be no fresher laurels to crown this day of your rejoicing than are brought by those now before you, who have been your co-workers in the strife, who have wrestled and suffered, fought and conquered with you, who rank you with the Miriams, the Deborahs, and the Judiths of old, and who now shout back the refrain when you utter the inspired song. Sing ye to the Lord, for he hath triumphed gloriously. The Almighty Lord hath disappointed them by the hand of a woman." End quote. In reply to this, Mrs. Stowe's brother, Henry Ward Beecher, said, quote, "Of course you all sympathize with me today, but standing in this place, I do not see your faces more clearly than I see those of my father and my mother. Her I only knew as a mere babe child. He was my teacher and my companion, a more guileless soul than he, a more honest one, more free from envy, from jealousy, and from selfishness, I never knew. Though he thought he was great by his theology, everybody else knew that he was great by his religion. My mother is to me what the Virgin Mary is to a devout Catholic. She was a woman of great nature, profound as a philosophical thinker, great in argument, with a kind of intellectual imagination, diffident, not talkative, in which respect I take after her. The woman who gave birth to Mrs. Stowe, whose graces and excellences she, probably more than any of her children, we number but 13, has possessed. I suppose that in bodily resemblance, perhaps, she is not like my mother, but in mind I presume she is most like her. I thank you for my father's sake and for my mother's sake, for the courtesy, the friendliness, and the kindness which you give to Mrs. Stowe." End quote. The following poem from John Greenleaf Whittier was then read. Thrice welcome from the land of flowers and golden-fruited orange bowers to this sweet green-turfed June of ours. To her who, in our evil time, dragged into light the nation's crime, with strength beyond the strength of men, and mightier than their sword, her pen. To her who worldwide entrance gave to the log cabin of the slave, made all his wrongs and sorrows known, and all earth's languages his own. North, south, and east, and west made all the common air electrical, until the o'ercharged bolts of heaven blazed down, and every chain was riven. Welcome from each and all to her whose wooing of the minister revealed the warm heart of the man beneath the creed-bound Puritan, and taught the kinship of the love of man below and God above. To her whose vigorous pencil strokes sketched into life her Oldtown Folks, whose fireside stories, grave or gay, in quaint Sam Lawson's vagrant way, with old New England's flavor rife, waifs from her rude idyllic life, are racy as the legends old by Chaucer or Boccaccio told. To her who keeps, through change of place and time, her native strength and grace, alike where warm Sorrento's smiles, or where by birchen-shaded isles, whose summer winds have shivered o'er the icy drift of Labrador, She lifts to light the priceless pearl of Harpswell's angel-beckoned girl. To her at 80 be tributes of the tongue and pen, by honor, praise, and heart thanks given, the loves of earth, the hopes of heaven. Ah, dearer than the praise that stirs the air today, our love is hers. She needs no guarantee of fame, whose own is linked with freedom's name. Long ages after ours shall keep her memory living while we sleep. The waves that wash our gray coastlines, the winds that rock the southern pines, shall sing of her. The unending years shall tell her tale in unborn ears. And when, with sins and follies past, are numbered color, hate, and caste, white, black, and red shall own as one the noblest work by woman done. This poem was followed by a few words from Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes, who also read the subjoined as his contribution to the chorus of congratulation. If every tongue that speaks her praise, for whom I shape my tinkling phrase, were summoned to the table, the vocal chorus that would meet of mingled accents, harsh or sweet, from every land and tribe, would beat the polyglots of Babel. Briton and Frenchman, Swede and Dane, Turk, Spaniard, Tartar of Ukraine, Hidalgo, Cossack, Cady, High Dutchman and Low Dutchman too, the Russian serf, the Polish Jew, Arab, Armenian, and Manchu would shout, "We know the lady." Know her? Who knows not Uncle Tom? And her he learned his gospel from has never heard of Moses. Full well the brave black hand we know that gave to freedom's grasp the hoe that killed the weed that used to grow among the southern roses. When Archimedes long ago spoke out so grandly, "Dopusto, give me a place to stand on, I'll move your planet for you now," he little dreamed or fancied how the Stowe at last should find its Po for a woman's faith to land on. Her lever was the wand of art, her fulcrum was the human heart, whence all unfailing aid is. She moved the earth, its thunders pealed, its mountains shook, its temples reeled, the blood-red fountains were unsealed, and Moloch sunk to Hades. All through the conflict, up and down, marched Uncle Tom and old John Brown, one ghost, one form ideal, and which was false, and which was true, and which was mightier of the two, the wisest Sibyl never knew, for both alike were real. Sister, the holy maid does well, who counts her beads in convent cell, where pale devotion lingers. But she who serves the sufferer's needs, whose prayers are spelt in loving deeds, may trust the Lord will count her beads as well as human fingers. When truth herself was slavery's slave, thy hand the prisoned suppliant gave the rainbow wings of fiction. And truth, whose sword descends today, bearing an angel's wreath away, its lilies at thy feet to lay, with heaven's own benediction. End quote. Poems written for the occasion by Mrs. A.D.T. Whitney, Miss Elizabeth Stewart Phelps, Mr. J.T. Trowbridge, Mrs. Allen, Mrs. Stowe's daughter, Mrs. Annie Fields, and Miss Charlotte F. Bates were also read, and speeches were made by Judge Albion W. Torgay and others prominent in the literary world. Letters from many noted people who were prevented from being present by distance or by other engagements had been received. Only 4 of them were read, but they were all placed in Mrs. Stowe's hands. The exercises were closed by a few words from Mrs. Stowe herself. As she came to the front of the platform, the whole company rose and remained standing until she had finished. In her quiet, modest way, and yet so clearly as to be plainly heard by all, she said, quote, "I wish to say that I thank all my friends from my heart. That is all. And one more thing, and that is, if any of you have doubt or sorrow or pain, if you have doubt about this world, just remember what God has done. Just remember that this great sorrow of slavery is gone by forever. I see it every day at the South. I walk about there and see the lowly cabins. I see these people growing richer and richer. I see men very happy in their lowly lot, but to be sure, you must have patience with them. They are not perfect, but have their faults, and they are serious faults in the view of white people. But they are very happy, that is evident, and they do know how to enjoy themselves, a great deal more than you do. An old Negro friend in our neighborhood has got a new, nice, 2-story house, and an orange grove, and a sugar mill. He has got a lot of money besides. Mr. Stowe met him one day, and he said, "I have got 20 head of cattle, 4 head of hoss, 40 head of hen, and I have got 10 children, all mine, every one mine." Well, now, that is a thing that a black man could not say once, and this man was 60 years old before he could say it. With all the faults of the colored people, take a man and put him down with nothing but his hands, and how many could say as much as that? I think they have done well. A little while ago they had at his house an evening festival for their church and raised $50. We white folks took our carriages, and when we reached the house we found it fixed nicely. Every one of his daughters knew how to cook. They had a good place for the festival. Their suppers were spread on little white tables with nice clean cloths on them. People paid 50 cents for supper. They got between $50 and $60 and had one of the best frolics you could imagine. They had also for supper ice cream, which they made themselves. That is the sort of thing I see going on around me. Let us never doubt everything that ought to happen is going to happen. End quote. Mrs. Stowe's public life ends with the garden party, and little more remains to be told. She had already, in 1880, begun the task of selection from the great accumulation of letters and papers relating to her life, and writes thus to her son in Saco, Maine, regarding the work. September 30th, 1880. My dear Charlie, my mind has been with you a great deal lately. I have been looking over and arranging my papers with a view to sifting out those that are not worth keeping, and so filing and arranging those that are to be kept, that my heirs and assigns may with the less trouble know where and what they are. I cannot describe to you the peculiar feelings which this review occasions. Reading old letters, when so many of the writers are gone from earth, seems to me like going into the world of spirits, letters full of the warm, eager, anxious, busy life that is forever past. My own letters, too, full of bygone scenes in my early life and the childish days of my children. It is affecting to me to recall things that strongly moved me years ago, that filled my thoughts and made me anxious, when the occasion and emotion have wholly vanished from my mind. But I thank God there is one thing running through all of them from the time I was 13 years old, and that is the intense, unwavering sense of Christ's educating, guiding presence and care. It is all that remains now. The romance of my youth is faded. It looks to me now, from my years, so very young. Those days when my mind only lived in emotion, and when my letters never were dated, because they were only histories of the internal. But now that I am no more and never can be young in this world, now that the friends of those days are almost all in eternity, what remains? Through life and through death, through sorrowing, through sinning, Christ shall suffice me as he hath sufficed. Christ is the end, and Christ the beginning and the end of all is Christ. I was passionate in my attachments in those far back years, and as I have looked over files of old letters, they are all gone except one, C. Van Rensselaer, Georgiana May, Delia Bacon, Clarissa Treat, Elizabeth Lyman, Sarah Colt, Elizabeth Phoenix, Frances Strong, Elizabeth Foster, I have letters from them all, but they have been long in spirit land and know more about how it is there than I do. It gives me a sort of dizzy feeling of the shortness of life and nearness of eternity when I see how many that I have traveled with are gone within the veil. Then there are all my own letters, written in the first 2 years of marriage when Mr. Stowe was in Europe and I was looking forward to motherhood and preparing for it. My letters when my whole life was within the 4 walls of my nursery, my thoughts absorbed by the developing character of children who have now lived their earthly life and gone to the eternal one. My 2 little boys, each in their way good and lovely, whom Christ has taken in youth, and my little one, my first Charlie, whom he took away before he knew sin or sorrow. Then my brother George and sister Catherine, the one a companion of my youth, the other the mother who assumed the care of me after I left home in my 12th year, and they are gone. Then my blessed Father, for many years so true an image of the Heavenly Father, in all my afflictions he was afflicted, in all my perplexities he was a sure and safe counselor, and he too is gone upward to join the angelic Mother, whom I scarcely knew in this world, who has been to me only a spiritual presence through life." End quote. In 1882, Mrs. Stowe writes to her son certain impressions derived from reading the Life and Letters of John Quincy Adams, which are given as containing a retrospect of the stormy period of her own life experience. Quote, "Your father enjoys his proximity to the Boston Library. He is now reading the 12 or 14 volumes of the Life and Diary of John Q. Adams. It is a history of our country through all the period of slavery usurpation that led to the war. The industry of the man in writing is wonderful. Every day's doings in the house are faithfully daguerreotyped. All the mean tricks, contrivances of the slave power, and the pusillanimity of the Northern members from day to day recorded. Calhoun was then Secretary of State. Under his connivance, even the United States Census was falsified to prove that freedom was bad for Negroes. Records of deaf, dumb, and blind, and insane colored people were distributed in Northern states, and in places where John Q. Adams had means of proving there were no Negroes. When he found that these falsified figures had been used with the English ambassador as reasons for admitting Texas as a slave state, the old man called on Calhoun and showed him the industriously collected proofs of the falsity of this census. He says, quote, "He writhed like a trodden rattlesnake, but said the census was full of mistakes, but one part balanced another. It was not worth while to correct them." End quote. His whole life was an incessant warfare with the rapidly advancing spirit of slavery that was coiling like a serpent around everything. At a time when the Southerners were like so many excited tigers and rattlesnakes, when they bullied and scoffed and sneered and threatened, this old man rose every day in his place, and knowing every parliamentary rule and tactic of debate, found means to make himself heard. Then he presented a petition from Negroes, which raised a storm of fury. The old man claimed that the right of petition was the right of every human being. They moved to expel him. By the rules of the House, a man, before he can be expelled, may have the floor and make his defense. This is just what he wanted. He held the floor for 14 days and used his wonderful powers of memory and arrangement to give a systematic, scathing history of the usurpations of slavery. He would have spoken 14 days more, but his enemies, finding the thing getting hotter and hotter, withdrew their motion, and the right of petition was gained. What is remarkable in this journal is the minute record of going to church every Sunday and an analysis of the text and sermon. There is something about these so simple, so humble, so earnest. Often differing from the speaker, but with gravity and humility, he seems always to be so self-distrustful, to have such a sense of sinfulness and weakness, but such trust in God's fatherly mercy as is most beautiful to see. Just the record of his Sunday sermons and his remarks upon them would be most instructive to a preacher. He was a regular communicant, and besides attended church on Christmas and Easter. I cannot but love the old man. He died without seeing even the dawn of liberty which God has brought, but I am sure he sees it from above. He died in the Capitol, in the midst of his labors, and the last words he said were, "This is the last of earth, I am content." And now, I trust, he is with God. All are gone, all that raged, all that threatened, all the cowards that yielded, truckled, sold their country for a mess of pottage, all the men that stood and bore infamy and scorn for the truth, all are silent in dust. The fight is over, but eternity will never efface from their souls whether they die well or ill, whether they fought bravely or failed like cowards. In a sense, our lives are irreparable. If we shrink, if we fail, if we choose the fleeting instead of the eternal, God may forgive us, but there must be an eternal regret. This man lived for eternity when hardest bested, for truth when truth was unpopular, for Christ when Christ stood chained and scourged in the person of the slave. End quote. In the fall of 1887, she writes to her brother, Reverend Dr. Edward Beecher of Brooklyn, New York. 49 Forest Street, Hartford, Connecticut, October 11th, 1887. Dear Brother, I was delighted to receive your kind letter. You were my earliest religious teacher. Your letters to me while a schoolgirl in Hartford gave me a high Christian aim and standard which I hope I have never lost. Not only did they do me good, but also my intimate friends, Georgiana May and Catherine Cogswell, to whom I read them. The simplicity, warmth, and childlike earnestness of those school days I love to recall. I am the only one living of that circle of early friends. Not one of my early schoolmates is living. And now Henry, younger by a year or two than I, has gone. My husband also. Footnote, Professor Stowe died August 1886. End footnote. I often think, why am I spared? Is there yet anything for me to do? I am thinking, with my son Charles's help, of writing a review of my life under the title, Pebbles from the Shores of a Past Life. Charlie told me that he has gotten all written up to my 12th or 13th year, when I came to be under Sister Catherine's care in Hartford. I am writing daily my remembrances from that time. You were then, I think, teacher of the grammar school in Hartford. So, my dear brother, let us keep good heart. No evil can befall us. Sin alone is evil, and from that Christ will keep us. Our journey is so short. I feel about all things now as I do about the things that happen in a hotel after my trunk is packed to go home. I may be vexed and annoyed, but what of it? I am going home soon. Your affectionate sister, Hattie. To a friend she writes a little later, quote, I have thought much lately of the possibility of my leaving you all and going home. I am come to that stage of my pilgrimage that is within sight of the river of death, and I feel that now I must have all in readiness day and night for the messenger of the King. I have sometimes had in my sleep strange perceptions of a vivid spiritual life near to and with Christ and multitudes of holy ones, and the joy of it is like no other joy. It cannot be told in the language of the world. What I have then I know with absolute certainty, yet it is so unlike and above anything we conceive of in this world that it is difficult to put it into words. The inconceivable loveliness of Christ. It seems that about him there is a sphere where the enthusiasm of love is the calm habit of the soul, that without words, without the necessity of demonstrations of affection, heart beats to heart, soul answers soul. We respond to the infinite love, and we feel his answer in us, and there is no need of words. All seemed to be busy coming and going on ministries of good, and passing each other gave a thrill of joy to each, as Jesus, the directing soul, the center of all, over all, in all, and through all, was working his beautiful and merciful will to redeem and save. I was saying as I awoke, "'Tis joy enough, my all in all, at thy dear feet to lie. Thou wilt not let me lower fall, and none can higher fly." This was but a glimpse, but it has left a strange sweetness in my mind. This ends our book, The Life of Harriet Beecher Stowe, compiled from her letters and journals by her son Charles Edward Stowe, published in 1890 by Houghton, Mifflin and Company, and read for you by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in August 2016. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it.